Good evening. This is Radio Free Mormon. Welcome to another episode. Today is June 28th, 2025. This is episode 405. The title is Mormon Thinking Errors or Thinking Errors Mormon Style. These things go through a lot of permutations as far as the titles go between their inception and the recording, and this is also the case here. Radio Free Mormon being joined by my friends to talk about Mormon thinking errors, Randall Bell, Dr. Randall Bell, who's made a ton of thinking errors in his life, so he's an expert. And
Yes.
Kolby Reddish, Esquire. Ditto for him.
Ditto.
How are you doing, Kolby?
I'm doing well this morning, making one of those thinking errors early this morning.
Yeah, saying yes when I asked you to come on the show to talk about thinking errors. Dr. Bell, how are you?
I am A-OK, thanks.
That looks like a new and spacious background you have.
I just moved, so I don't have pictures on the wall yet.
Okay. Well, I can help with that if you want. I like early Marvel.
I'm in.
Okay. Well, Dr. Bell, can you give us a 30-second thumbnail of yourself, and then Kolby, the same for you?
Oh, sure. I am Randall Bell or Randy Bell, whatever. I am from Southern California. I live in Laguna Beach. I left the Mormon church about 10 years ago. And that's when I very first heard about critical thinking and really got into it. And now I teach courses coast to coast on critical thinking and junk science.
Great. Thank you so much, Kolby.
Yeah, I'm Kolby Reddish. I'm an attorney that practices law in Boise, Idaho. I also serve as an adjunct law professor. I left the church in 2022. After in 2021, my sitting bishop was arrested for child sexual abuse, and the church really rallied around him rather than victims and survivors. So that was kind of my last straw, or the catalyst for my exit from the church.
So you took the catalyst theory of leaving the church.
I sure did.
Got it. A lot of people are doing that nowadays. It's fashionable. Mm-hmm. Well, what we're talking about today is thinking errors. And the fun thing about today's show is that we're not only going to talk about 12 is the number. It might be 11. There was a little confusion right before the show started on the number, okay? I was going for 12. Each of us were going to do 4. Some of us may not have done everything that they were asked to do, but that's okay. We're not judgmental here, all right?
It's like the opposite of a RFM. It's like the opposite of a baker's dozen.
Yes, exactly. So here's the thing, all right? My impression of logical fallacies has always been there's this ocean of them, and it's intimidating, and a lot of them have weird names. Now, some of them I've gotten from the first time I heard them, like in 8th grade, right? The bandwagon fallacy, everybody's doing it. It's popular, so why don't you do it too? Mm-hmm. That's a logical fallacy. That's not one that we're going to talk about tonight. But what I wanted to do is take the top 12 logical fallacies that are used so frequently in common life and not only talk about what they are, but more importantly, and hopefully to make it really fun, to give examples of that logical fallacy in Mormonism. And that's why this show is titled Mormon Thinking Errors. And amazingly enough, for all 12 of these, it's like there's a lot of examples that I could find, at least for my 4. I can't speak for the other 2 gentlemen on the screen, but at least for me, I could find a lot of examples for each one, and I had to stop at some point. The church is rife with thinking errors. In fact, it could almost be said after today's show that to be a Mormon is to engage in thinking errors and logical fallacies because they're used all the time. And hopefully by the time we're done in a couple hours, you'll see what we're talking about and maybe even agree with us. So here is the cover slide, Mormonism's top logical fallacies. Radio Free Mormon, that's me, featuring Dr. Randy Bell and Kolby Reddish, some rando. So the next slide here says previously on RFM, and Kolby always slips this one in on me. Do you want to say anything about this, Kolby?
I think if you'll go forward, here's what I had in mind, just to remind people, as you already did, why we came up with this topic. So people know that you and I have been going through the Light and Truth Letter series. We often get texts from Randy after our Light and Truth Letter series, pointing out things we should have said. I appreciate that, Randy.
Things we shouldn't have said, things we got wrong. Yeah, I always love getting texts from Randy.
Anytime I include a clip from Christopher Hitchens, I know I'm going to hear it from Randy.
And why is that? We got to let the audience in on this if they don't know.
Oh, why is that? I don't know.
Why? Why do you always hear from Randy whenever you include a clip from Christopher Hitchens.
I am a bigger fan of him than Randy. That's all.
Chris Hitchens is a famous atheist, and Randy's not.
True.
I read his book. Have you guys read his book? It's hard to follow his logic, but anyway.
Yeah,
Okay.
he's really a polemicist. But in the course of doing the Light and Truth Letter series, the last episode we did was the Fruits in the Church episode. And we really didn't go through the substance of that episode because instead we focused on logical fallacies. The two logical fallacies we focused on in that chapter were the arguments from consequences, which is the entire chapter. It's an argument that, you know, the church is true because the church has these positive benefits, which is an argument from consequences and is fallacious. So it doesn't go to the truth of the actual claims. The other fallacy that we talked about, and I brought my brave little toaster friend here, Cobley, to highlight the begging the question fallacy, which is when a worldview is only internally consistent. And so it's basically self-powered. That's why our little toaster friend is plugged into himself, which I do not recommend people try, either thinking wise, the analogy, or literally. And so we really go ahead.
And certainly not if they're on a mission.
Definitely
so we've got
not.
some electrician people who are doing work. They're actually working for a living here at the office on this Saturday morning. And so there may be some loud noises. Did you hear that loud noise?
Mm-mm.
Okay, well, then there's nobody here, and we'll proceed as normal. That's why I stuttered on what I said, because there was a loud noise.
Oh.
And I stopped for the noise because I thought that would be overriding what I was saying. All right, so those are the two. We're not talking about those today.
Nope.
But those are the two that led up to having today's show, which is not going to be really talking about the Light on Truth letter. We're going to give that a rest for another week, but we'll get back to it. And I know Austin and his wife will be pleased. So logical fallacies. This was put in here in order just to describe what a logical fallacy is. Which one of you two put this in here?
That was me. So this is actually from that slideshow, RFM. I really just liked this description of what a fallacy is, that they are deceptively bad arguments. And if people remember from the last episode, we talked about how they're almost like the wagon ruts for wagon wheels that our brains automatically think. The one that you used at the opening of the show, the bandwagon fallacy, is I think one of the most prevalent, that people think that way, right? They think, oh, if I agree with most people, then I'm probably right. And the fact is that's fallacious thinking. So I like this term, deceptively bad arguments, when we focus on why fallacies matter. And then I think the next couple slides are Randy's take on introducing us to critical thinking and epistemology from his point of view. Dr.
Bell. Oh, wait, you got another one in here. I'm sorry. Hang on a second, Randy. Kolby put this one in and forgot. And it's great too.
I did. This is how we decided to do this episode, is we were talking about how so many of Austin's arguments in the Light and Truth letter are fallacies. And so because they're fallacies, they don't go to the truth of the matter that we're talking about. And so we were joking about it being like Marley's ghost in the opening paragraph of A Christmas Carol. Instead
opening
of Marley.
Line. You can do the opening line. It's the opening line. Absolutely.
Yep. So instead of Marley, we've got Austin's arguments were dead to begin with.
Dead as a doornail. So there we go. Okay. Did you want to say anything more about that? But I love the picture of you as Marley's ghost. This is the chain I forged in life, Ebenezer, link by link and yard by yard.
That's actually Austin, not me.
Okay. Oh, that is Austin. You're right. I'm sorry.
You can see he's bound by the Light and Truth letter. It's just dragging him down.
I can tell by the glow in his face.
Yeah.
He hasn't lost the light in his eyes like you, Kolby.
And this is the three of us as a few famous trios, the three amigos, the Hogwarts trio, and whatever that godforsaken image on the right is, which was an attempt to make us Han, Luke, and Leia, but you know, it didn't work. So
this is why AI must not pass.
Because it put you in a dress. Yeah.
Well, it's just, I mean, it's obviously up to no good. And I had looked at the middle one with it, which is from Harry Potter, and I had said to you what I said. Are you in Ravenclaw or something?
Yeah, I'm a secret traitor, it looks like.
I know you got a blue tie there. Okay, critical thinking. Now this is Dr. Bell. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. The first thing I like to say on every episode I do, wherever I do it, is don't believe a word I say, research what I say. You will never hear that in general conference, by the way, but you're always going to hear it from me, and I think you guys would agree. Do the research and check things out independently of what you hear. So the next slide.
Dr. Bell, I would actually even go further and say we hear the opposite from the general authorities. We hear believe what we say and don't research it.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. That's exactly what they say. In fact, we're going to get into that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the thing about critical thinking, it's a very big topic. A lot of people do what, speaking of logical fallacies, is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's basically, I have a son, and when I'm at lunch with him, I'll bring up a topic. He will not know what I'm talking about. He won't know the topic. I can see him texting or with his phone under the table, looking up Wikipedia. He reads the first sentence from Wikipedia, and voila, he's now an expert on that topic. And it's something I see all the time with the term critical thinking, is people think, oh, I'm an expert in critical thinking because I can think. The thing about critical thinking, and I was just in Florida teaching a 2-day seminar on this, is that it's a very, very big topic. There are very clear delineations of categories between cognitive bias and logical fallacies and critical thinking itself, and then that breaks down. And there are literally hundreds upon hundreds of these concepts. What I'm trying to do with this exhibit is make it simple and accessible and presentation friendly. And this is Aristotle. Aristotle taught ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos is your emotions. I will just, spoiler alert, the Mormon Church is all about emotion. And we're going to talk about more of that later with testimonies. That's all emotion. But
Dr.
what you've
Bell?
got, and emotions are fine, but you've got to have logos, which is logic, and you have to have ethos, which is ethics. So that's Aristotle. I added duos, meaning look at both sides of the story. I mean, like we're just talking about, when I came out of the church, I wiped the slate clean, everything, religion, Christianity, atheism. I went fresh and read the books, and I got both sides of the story directly from their source. So I'm well versed in the various worldviews. I'm certainly not so well versed that I know everything by a long shot, but you gotta look at both sides. So that's kind of a simple egos, logos, pathos, duos model to give us kind of some traction into the world of critical thinking. What do you guys think?
How
I
does
think
the
Randy,
church?
Colby might have a question or two.
How does the church do with ethics, Randy?
Oh, it sucks. I mean, look at that question, Colby, from historically to today. I'm doing a book right now, and it's on predator behavior. And the title of the book is Monetizing Jesus, and how predators bait us and how to outsmart them. And it's about critical thinking. And so go back historically with the church. What predators do is they shift from mind, body, and soul, which is holistic and healthy, to an undue emphasis on sex, power, and money. You see that with Jeffrey Epstein. You see it with Joseph Smith. You see it with David Koresh. You take any predator from history or today's predators, you see this emphasis. So going back historically, the church, had, with Joseph Smith and Kirtland, this thing about money, so much that they filled up a trunk with bricks and put a thin layer of silver dollars at the top and started a phony illegal bank. There's an example of money. With sex, it's hard to outperform Joseph Smith. I don't think I ever dated 40 women, more or less married them secretly behind my wife's back, more or less 14-year-old girls. So talk about sex, it's insane. Power, Joseph Smith marched his militia all over the place, demonstrating, and flexing his power. So right up to today, you got the SEC with hundreds of billions of dollars that have been hidden. That's unethical and illegal. You got sex. I mean, $250 million in Boy Scout related child abuse. And it goes everything from your example, Colby, with your bishop, to literally thousands of cases. Just go to floodlight.org. And one of my clients is actually the attorney that took down the Catholic Church. And I talked to him about the Mormon Church. And let me just say, it's ripe. All I'm going to say is they're on very thin ice, because their child abuse issues are so enormous. Power, I live in California. Prop 8 was a flex with power, and they got in trouble for that. So again, sex, power, and money. You see illegal things going on both historically and today.
Thanks,
Great
Randy.
answer. Okay, are we ready to proceed to the next slide?
Yeah.
Oh, this is me. Okay, so I've got the first 4 logical fallacies. I've got them numbered, I've got the name, and I've got some examples. And I'm going to go through my 4, and then Randy's going to go through his 3 or 4. Colby's going to go through his 4 or 5. We'll get to 11 or 12 there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through mine. Please feel free to jump in any place you want. But mainly I'm going to go through it. I'll stop at the end of this section about the Motte and Bailey fallacy. And then we'll discuss, okay? But definitely jump in wherever you want. Motte and Bailey. Now, some of these have difficult names, and this is one that I only recently really, really learned, and I'm so thrilled about it. And now I can see it everywhere because this one gets used a lot. It's also called shifting the goalposts, but I like Motte and Bailey because once you understand the Motte and Bailey concept, then it's really, really clear, at least for me. It's a strategy where a bold or controversial claim is defended by retreating to a more defensible, watered-down version when challenged. Okay, so what this means is you're making a bold claim in an argument. It gets challenged effectively. And so you realize that you can't continue to defend that point against this enemy. Therefore, you retreat to a much better guarded situation. This is what it looks like, okay? And this helps me too. So the Bailey is the main part of the city, okay? It has walls around it. It can be defended. There's that drawbridge. So let's just say this isn't so idyllic and peaceful. You have people actually attacking from the outside. Well, you can defend that Bailey up to a point, but you have to defend a lot more space because there's a bigger circumference, all right? If you get overrun or if you get to the point where you cannot defend the Bailey, remember that's the specific argument that now you're getting in trouble with, that you get in trouble. So now you retreat to Helm's Deep. That's the wooden keep up there on the little mountain. And I think that's the Motte part, M-O-T-T-E, Motte and Bailey. So it's very frequent to have this kind of defense many hundreds of years ago. So if you get in trouble at the Bailey, you can retreat to the Motte up the hill, smaller, easier to defend, and keep the people who are trying to get you off. All right. So that's the idea between the Motte and Bailey. And the way it works in the argument, again, is if you're making a specific claim that is controversial and you get in trouble with it, then you retreat to the Motte. And the Motte is a more generalized claim that is easier to defend. Now, that's a lot of rhetoric. Let me give you some examples so you can see what it is I'm talking about. First off, we're going to look at the Bailey, then the Motte. This one has to do with homosexuality and the causes of it in the LDS Church, according to the leaders of the LDS Church. In 1981, there was a manual on homosexuality that was released to the leaders of the church, and it stated that homosexual behavior is learned and influenced by an unhealthy childhood, masturbation, and experimentation. So those are the controversial claims regarding the causes of homosexuality in 1981. The church now has been challenged on that. And those ideas have now come into disrepute. They are not believed anymore that these are the causes of homosexuality. Therefore, the church is now retreated up that hill, right, to the Motte. And the Motte is over here on the right from the church's handbook, the current handbook, right? 38.6.12, same-sex attraction and same-sex behavior. It says, the church does not take a position. Repeat, the church does not take a position on the causes of same-sex attraction. So there's an instance of Motte and Bailey, all right? The church in 1981 gives a specific and controversial claim, or at least it becomes controversial over time. I think it was controversial then, but it's more controversial now. So it's controversial. They get called on it. So now they're going to back away from it and go to the more easily defended Motte of the church does not take a position on the causes of same-sex attraction. Does that make it somewhat clear what the Motte and Bailey logical fallacy is? And you can see people do this in real time once you get accustomed to it. So I'm going to give you a few more examples, all right?
Can I say one thing about that last example, Arthur?
Yeah, please.
I think one of the biggest problems with the Motte and Bailey, like when I'm dealing with an interlocutor and they engage in this behavior, one of the classic hallmarks of it is that they will not acknowledge that they've changed their position. It's okay for us to change our position or to change our mind when we're presented with new behavior. That's what we want people to do. But why Motte and Bailey is a logical fallacy, or why it's such a problematic logical fallacy, is that the person who's shifting their position often will not acknowledge that their original position was incorrect. The church never does this, famously, right? They even say that they don't seek or give apologies. And so that to me is the biggest problem, it's not the change in position, it's the unacknowledgement of the changing position that is the real problem, that feels like gaslighting when you encounter it.
And frequently, as soon as they reach another opponent, they'll be out in the Bailey again, making the same controversial claim. And they don't go to the Motte unless the opponent they're facing in this particular battle knows the answer.
Yeah,
right?
And
Knows the
another
answer
thing
to the
on top
controversial-
of that, and it's related, is the church's policy that we don't give apologies. I mean, we all make mistakes. I mean, if we're honest, and yet, you know, to see an organization that will not apologize for such egregious behavior is kind of related to what you just brought up, Kolby.
Very good. So let's drill this home with a couple more examples. The Book of Mormon, the Bailey argument, the more specific argument that became controversial was in the introduction to the Book of Mormon, where it talked about the Native Americans and the Lamanites, right? And it's saying, and they, the Lamanites, are the principal ancestors of the American Indians. Okay, that's a more definite, more controversial, more specific claim. And that got challenged on the basis of DNA. And so they changed their language in the introduction to they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. So you can see what they did here. And if you envision that going from the Bailey to the Motte, you can see this is a classic example of the Motte and Bailey logical fallacy. They made a specific argument. They got called on it, and it's proven not to be correct. So then they go to a more generalized statement. They are among the ancestors of the American Indians. They have so many of these in Mormonism. Every time Mormonism, and I've talked about this and Bill's talked about this, Mormonism has gone from knowing things. The leaders have gone from claiming to know things of a spiritual nature to now they don't know things anymore. They keep backing away from their knowledge. Revelation under Joseph Smith used to be a game of addition. Now it's a game of subtraction, and it has been for some time. We're subtracting things that have been revealed. And now the church leaders claim to not know. Every one of those is a Motte and Bailey fallacy, going from a specific argument that becomes controversial and then backing away to, well, we don't have a position on that anymore. This one was the Watson letter from 1990, which said something that should not surprise anyone in the church, at least not as of 1990, that the Hill Cumorah in upstate New York is the same Hill Cumorah mentioned in the Book of Mormon, where the last battle of the Nephites and Lamanites took place. And that's signed by the secretary of the First Presidency. Well, this caused the Farms gang, who want everything to have happened down in Central America, to go crazy, because this can't be the position of the church because it conflicts with their theory, even though it makes complete sense with the Book of Mormon and what Joseph Smith said about the Book of Mormon and what everybody knew about the Book of Mormon who was a member of the church who said anything about it and Cumorah at the time. And by that, I mean in the early 19th century. It was commonly understood. So now, as of January 2019, the church has on its official website placed the following, which is the Motte. All right. They say, since the publication of the Book of Mormon in 1830, members and leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have expressed numerous opinions about the specific locations of the events discussed in the book. You can see what's coming, can't you? The last part says, today, the church's only position is that the events in the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon describes took place in the ancient Americas. That's the only position that the church has on Book of Mormon geography, which even takes out Cumorah and the last battle being on that hill in upstate New York. So once again, you got the Bailey, and you wouldn't even think that was that controversial, but it has become so from 1990 that it happened on that hill. Now we don't even know what hill it took place on. So
Isn't
this is
that
the clip.
isn't
I'm
that
sorry,
just
go ahead, please.
sorry, I just wanted to say, isn't that such a weird claim? Like, if you go back to that last sentence, you really could end the sentence, like the operative provisions of the sentence, add with took place. Because if you can't point to where an event took place, you're really just saying that it occurred. Like, if you asked me, if we were to apply this, and I think using like common life examples can help drive these points home sometimes. If you were to ask me, RFM, like, where did you withdraw the money that you brought to dinner or whatever? And I told you, and I couldn't tell you where. Like, if I could tell you, oh, it certainly happened, but I just kept not answering the question of where, it sure looks like maybe that didn't happen, right? And I just want to highlight that it's such an oddly unfalsifiable claim of basically saying these events definitely took place, just please don't ask us where. That's really what they're saying.
No, and what you can tell from this is that there's no place that works.
Right.
And they've been looking. Mormons have been looking for a long time now to find a place that works, and they've been looking hard, and they haven't come up with anything because every place they have has problems, whether it's Mesoamerica, whether it's the Heartland, whether it's the hemispheric model, which is, I think, really what Joseph Smith was into and what he believed and what he saw the Book of Mormon as representing or crafted it to represent, was the entire hemisphere. But none of those things work. They all have problems, and therefore the church says, well, we're not going to take a position on it because we're going to go to the Motte to defend this position.
Even their use of that term opinions, leaders and members expressed opinions, is its own like mini Motte and Bailey inside the Motte and Bailey. Because when Joseph Smith was expressing where the location of the Book of Mormon events took place, when he was expressing an opinion on who the Lamanites were, those weren't opinions the way that they're trying to represent them today. They were authoritative positions,
right,
of the guy who knew more about the Book of Mormon than anyone else. There's its own little mini Motte and Bailey and spoiler equivocation that we'll talk about later.
Yeah, and I just want to add, I think this is a brilliant example because the Hill Cumorah is so demonstratively nonsense. I think it was, if my memory is right, I think it was you, Kolby, that brought up that the ancient, in Ether, it talks about 2 million soldiers. And that's bigger than the Roman Empire at the height of the Roman Empire. That's bigger than the U.S. military today. And they can't find anything. It's a big, fat zero donut in terms of archaeological evidence of any battle, with chariots and swords and breastplates and blah, blah, blah. So it's really a insurmountable problem for Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is one of the main reasons that apologists went seeking far and wide for the real Cumorah, because the Cumorah that Joseph Smith identified as the Cumorah, no way could it be where these battles happened. Okay, so here is an example in real time. This is about a 3-minute clip. It's from something that Kolby and I did. It's called How Mormons Lie to You. And this has to do with the Motte and Bailey logical fallacy, which we identify. And this has to do with this classic Motte and Bailey in the church, okay? I'm going to go ahead and describe it. And what it is this, is that we have prophets of God who God speaks to, and God tells them what it is we need to do. That is the Bailey. That is the controversial claim. That frequently will get called on by people and often by saying, well, didn't a prophet make this mistake in the past, right? Or what about this or some other thing? Now, when that happens, apologists are geared to go to the Motte because it's easier to defend. And that is, well, we pray about things ourselves. We pray about things ourselves, and we're told to pray about things ourselves and study it out in our minds so that we're part of this process too. And we don't just take the prophet's word for it, which is what the prophet tells us to do. And frankly, what Mormons do, because you're supposed to. That's what Mormons do. That's the whole point of having a prophet on the earth. Prophets teach us the truth, as President Nelson said not that long ago. And the Doctrine and Covenants in Section 1 still has, whether by mine own voice or by the voice of my servants, it is the same. And that gets quoted a lot in General Conference and other materials in order to show Mormons that they need to listen to the words of the prophets because they speak for God. They are the servants of God, and their voice is the same as God's unto us.
I have to interject an amendment. I think President Nelson said prophets always teach the truth. It's kind of implicit in saying that you teach the truth, but I'm almost positive that's the way he actually said it.
He probably did, but he's speaking one prophet until he dies. Then another prophet can come up and teach a different truth until they die, and then another prophet. And he's even goofed that up, because it was under his, at least not his administration, but under his strong arming, I understand, that the revelation from November of 2015, the policy of exclusion on the family, came about largely because of President Nelson. And he's the one who proclaimed it as revelation in January of 2018. And then 3.5 years later, after he became the president, they had to reverse it. Okay?
It's from the same team that brought you temporary commandments, temporary truths.
These are so temporary. You don't want to blink or you might miss them. So I'm going to play this. Okay, this is 3 minutes, and let's see how this works.
Yes.
Okay, we'll give it a go.
You know what's interesting about that is I have less of a problem with the objective truth claims and more of a problem with them saying, but don't look into it. Like, don't test it. Like, what I say goes, and you're not allowed to explore it.
Are you serious? We are literally taught in scripture to study these things out in our minds. Behold, you have not understood. You have supposed that I would give it unto you when you took no thought, save it was to ask me. But behold, I say unto you that you must study it out in your mind, and then you must ask me if it be right. And we have been taught by our leaders that we are to seek truth from wherever it may come. It is our duty and calling to gather every item of truth and reject every error, from the sciences to philosophy, wherever it may be found. Whether a truth be found with professed infidels, or with the Universalists, or with the Church of Rome, or the Methodists, or any other of the different sects and parties.
Okay, if you'll go to the next slide, I remember what I was thinking here.
Can I
Do
mention
you have any
something here
thoughts on
that you
that?
may not mention about it, but it strikes me now,
Sure.
because now that I understand the Motte and Bailey fallacy, I see it everywhere. This has been going on forever in the Mormon church. And since at least I joined the church in 1978, and that is there are two positions that they hold simultaneously. And what they want to advance, what their real position is, and I don't know if this is the Motte or the Bailey. Once again, I understand the argument. I know
The Bailey is
one
the
that's-
smaller.
What is Motte?
The Bailey is the smaller
Okay,
argument.
so the Bailey argument is we have prophets on the face of the earth who talk to God, and we need to do what it is they tell us to do, because obviously that's what God wants us to do. The prophet, he talks to him, right? That's the truth, or I should say that's the Bailey argument. When they are called on it, like this fellow did on the Joe Rogan show, the typical practice is to do exactly what Jacob Hansen just did, and that's to retreat from the Bailey to the Motte and say, I can't defend that, but I can defend this, which is in our scriptures. And yeah, it is. And you'll find things said by prophets. The problem is that the church doesn't operate that way. It is very clear that the prophet speaks for God. You do what the prophet says. And if you don't do what the prophet says, you are running afoul of God. You have the right to have personal revelation. That's the Bailey. But if your revelation contradicts what the prophet says, then you're getting your revelation from the wrong source. Okay? That's the Bailey. But when you're called on it, then you back up and say, no, we're asked to study it out in our mind, to come to our own decisions, and then to ask God if our opinion is right. Well, that's all pointless. It's all ridiculous. Because if God tells you, why do you have to ask God if what the prophet has told you is right?
Whenever I hear one of these arguments like he just made, I refer to Joseph Smith, chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, where I'm paraphrasing Mormon God, who says they're all wrong, they're all corrupt, and they're all, what's the third one? Three alls. In the courtroom, the last thing you want to say in something broad is all, and make an absolute, because you find one exception and your whole argument blows up. And they're all wrong, they're all corrupt, and they're all an abomination. And to flip and say, well, now we're looking at truth for Methodists and Universalists, and that is a direct contradiction to what Mormon God said in Joseph Smith chapter 1 verses 18 and 19.
Very good, very good. So there's a Motte and Bailey That was a great example. I think it was a good example. Do you think it was an okay example, Colby?
No, that was a perfect example. Yeah, and I even coming from Jacob Hansen, it gave me hives a little bit, but I think it was a perfect example.
Well, here's another one. Okay, when he's called on the accuracy of the claims he makes in his Light on Truth letter, Austin 5 famously says, "I'm just a dude who wrote a letter." Can you see it now? Motte and Bailey scurrying up the hill, right? I don't have to justify or defend these claims because, hey, I'm just a dude who wrote a letter.
And when we get to one of Randy's examples of shift of the burden of proof, pay attention to that thumbnail there that said, "Disbelief is a leap of faith."
Okay, this is the email that it came from, right? You were actually communicating with Austin 5.
Mm-hmm.
And he with you.
I think this was on Reddit. Or no, this was on YouTube, actually. You're right.
Right, and you were calling him out on some of his misstatements, and he said, as you may have guessed, I'm just a dude who wrote a letter. So, I guess I'm off the hook for any misstatements, all the misstatements in the Light on Truth letter. So, Motte and Bailey. Here's another one. Do you remember the Corbridge maneuver?
Mm-hmm.
This is Elder Corbridge who gave this talk. I think it was called about standing for something, maybe. It'll be in a future slide. But he tried to make this distinction between primary questions and secondary questions in the LDS Church. And the whole idea is to have 4 primary questions which are unfalsifiable. They have to do with belief in Jesus Christ, in God, in the prophet. Those are his primary questions. All of his secondary questions are all the falsifiable ones where Mormonism gets in trouble. So what he wants to do is create a model where only primary questions are important. They are not falsifiable. But all the secondary questions are not important because they are falsifiable.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say because they're falsifiable. I am attributing that to him because it's implicit in the model. This whole model is based upon the Motte and Bailey fallacy. Here's what he says. There are only a few primary questions. You can see the primary questions are at the top of the hill in the Motte. There are only a few primary questions. I will mention 4 of them. Is there a God who is our Father? Is Jesus Christ the Son of God, the Savior of the world? Was Joseph Smith a prophet? Is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints the kingdom of God on the earth? So basically, your testimony things, right? The things you say in testimony, those are the primary questions. They cannot be falsified. You must get a spiritual witness for them. And that gets back to what Randy was saying with an overemphasis on the emotions.
Mm-hmm.
He continues. By contrast, the secondary questions are unending. They include questions about church history, polygamy, people of African descent, and the priesthood, women in the priesthood, how the Book of Mormon was translated, the Pearl of Great Price, DNA and the Book of Mormon, gay marriage, the different accounts of the first vision, and on and on. I wonder, does anybody ever stop and wonder, like I did at one point, why are there so many freaking secondary questions in this church? Why is everything a problem? Isn't there anything that's just normal, straightforward, and doesn't have problems with it as you start to dive into it? Once again, this is from January 2019 when he gave this talk. And this is the last slide from his talk. He says this, there are some who are afraid the church may not be true and who spend their time and attention slogging through the swamp of the secondary questions. They mistakenly try to learn the truth by process of elimination, by attempting to eliminate every doubt. Process of eliminate, that sounds like Sherlock Holmes. Well, that's a dumb idea. Somebody as dumb as Sherlock Holmes would have come up with that idea. That is always a bad idea, he says. Tell it to Sherlock, pal. It will never work. Each time you track down an answer to any one antagonistic claim, why does it have to be antagonistic? Each time you track down an answer to any one antagonistic claim and look up, there is another one staring you in the face. Answer, because they're everywhere. Answers to the primary questions do not come by answering the secondary questions.
Yeah. How dare you think that understanding how Joseph Smith engaged in polygamy would inform the question, or would it help you answer the question of whether he's a prophet?
Exactly. Very good. Yes. They are answers to the secondary, but I'm sorry,
Well,
Dr. Bell.
I was just going to quickly say that when I left the church 10 years ago, I still have him as a friend, a very prominent attorney who is very bright and very Mormon. And I said, look, John, I shouldn't have said his, well, anyway, I said, look, guy, I said, I
tell him,
still
Steve.
believe in Jesus and I still believe in God. I just don't believe in Joseph Smith. And he says, well, you know, it really worries me because I think you've gone to a very dark place. And so it's what they're really trying to do is mesh God and Joseph Smith into one thing. Whereas when you segregate out Joseph Smith, and the criticism is directed solely at Joseph Smith and his polygamy and his character, and let's face it, the Mormon Church is no better than the character of Joseph Smith because we have to rely upon him for so much in terms of the first vision, and that's an episode. The Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, everything is according to Joseph Smith. So we got to look at his character and test his character. And to isolate Joseph Smith and forget God and Jesus and all these other things, because that's more of a universal concept with many, many billions of people. And just focus on Joseph Smith and say, I'm in a dark place, really, according to him, because of Joseph Smith. That really kind of frames the question better in my mind, at least.
Right. And it gets back to the fact that Joseph Smith speaks for God. So therefore, if you reject Joseph Smith, you are rejecting God. That is the Bailey. Remember, the Motte is, you figure it out for yourself.
Yeah.
So finishing off on this, this quote from Brother Corbridge, there are answers to the secondary questions. I'm just not going to tell them to you. There are answers to the secondary questions, but you cannot prove a positive by disproving every negative. Well, no, but some of those negatives can disprove the positives, which is why he's trying to get you to not think about the secondary questions because they're going to mess with his primary questions. You cannot prove the church is true by disproving every claim made against it. That will never work. It is a flawed strategy. Although we may not know the answer to every question, we must know the answers to the primary questions. Okay, and those can only be ascertained through emotion, apparently. Okay, so any questions about that before I go to straw man? Or any comments about that? Maybe we already just did that. Okay, so let's go to straw man. It's number 2, the straw man argument. Having finished Motte and Bailey, we go on to the straw man. This is defined as misrepresenting an opponent's position to make it easier to attack. I think that generally people have a better idea about what a straw man is than maybe some others like Motte and Bailey. At least I did. There's an example here. A critic might say there are serious historical problems with the Book of Abraham translation. And an apologist's response, critics just can't accept that God can work through revelation instead of secular scholarship. So they're trying to make a straw man there, right? The actual argument about historical claims gets distorted into an attack on faith itself.
RFM, can I make one comment about the relationship between those two fallacies? I look at these two things as flip sides of the same coin. If you're misrepresenting your own argument to make it easier to defend, you're engaged in a Motte and Bailey. If you are misrepresenting the other person's argument to make it easier to attack, you're engaged in straw man. That's why they can look pattern-wise very similar, but it's about which claim you're trying to monkey with to make it either easier to attack or easier to defend.
That's great. Thank you for that. Now, I'm only going to give one example of this, and it's going to be a bit of a prolonged example. That's why I'm going to limit myself to one because it's absolutely beautiful. Because in an episode on the Light on Truth letter that Kolby and I did, we're responding to something that, Austin Fife had written in his letter. And what we're talking about is we're talking about Missouri, and the conflict between the Mormons and the settlers, the Missourians, that happened in the 1830s. Now, we are talking about Jacob Hansen and his discussion with Alex O'Connor and how it was that Jacob Hansen will only say positive things about the church and that this is the way Mormons lie to you. They will only give you the sanitized, whitewashed narrative, and they will not tell you about anything that contradicts that, no matter how historically relevant and accurate it is. So one of those things is this. Jacob Hansen mentions to Alex O'Connor about Governor Lilburn Boggs signing the executive order of extermination on the Mormons in October of 1838. That was a bad thing. Alex O'Connor responds appropriately. What Jacob Hansen does not mention is that in July of the same year, Sidney Rigdon, as a member of the first presidency down there in Missouri, had openly proclaimed, and I believe it was published thereafter, that the Mormons that if the Missourians come upon them, the Mormons need to exterminate the Missourians. Okay, so he was the one who used exterminate first. Now, when we were talking about this, Kolby and I were very careful because we know that the temptation on the other side, because they engage in logical fallacies all the time, is going to be to take what we're saying and make a straw man out of it, that we're saying the Mormons started it, because that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that he's only telling one side of the story and not the other, because this is how we're trained to represent the church to other people as Mormons. We don't tell both sides of the story, but we were very clear to say that we are not trying to make a pronouncement on who started it. Okay, it takes two to tango. Nevertheless, in spite of all the language that we used about that issue, and that we're not saying who started it, of course, what Jacob Hansen did was he cut the very first part that we said and then pretended like we were arguing that the Mormons started it and the Mormons deserved what they got. It was a complete straw man. It was a straw man we saw coming, and it was a straw man that we did everything that we could in our power to avoid happening. But it's a straw man that occurred nonetheless at the hands of Jacob Hansen, because he's got no response to what we said. So he's going to straw man it into a much easier thing for him to attack. And that's what he does. Do you have anything you want to say about this, Kolby, before I play the clip? The clip is like 13 minutes long, but I'm going to put it on 1.25 speed. Go ahead, Kolby.
Well, I'd also just say that particular straw man example, he's trying to make it sound like, exactly like you said, like we were saying Mormons deserved it. And so he's also going back to Randy's use of the different pieces of our brain, or pieces of rhetorical arguments, logos, pathos, and ethos. He's trying to inflame people's ethos against us, their emotional appeal, because if we were to have actually said that the Mormons deserved it, that would be abhorrent, which is why we took such caution to not say that. And so it's a straw man where he's explicitly trying to inflame people's ethical and emotions against us. That's why I loved this. When we then responded back, we came up with, this is, I think, one of the best thumbnails you had ever done. So I made an adorable claymation version of it that I put here.
This looks like something that Van Gogh might have done.
It does look like Van Gogh. You take the one ear off.
Yeah, if Van Gogh were into clay as a medium.
That's right.
All right, so here we go. Here, this is going to be it. I'm going to change the screen. I'll take that one down, put this one up, because this one I can play. And I'll put it on 1.25, but everybody listen, it's less than 10 minutes. I had said 12. It's less than 10 minutes. So hopefully we can make it through this, and it'll make sense, because this is a video we made after all of this to recapitulate what we had done and what Jacob said and how it was just a straw man.
Religious beliefs are in fundamental tension with like living in society. I'm not saying that it was justified that they were chased from their homes, or that they were harmed, or that people were killed. I would never justify that. And in fact, to make the overall point of how closely do these people even listen to us before they respond to us, that's the way they represent our argument, that we're justifying this. I went back to the transcript and polled. There are at least 3 explicit examples, and I'm going to read them before we listen to their clip so that people can keep in mind and see whether our argument is accurately represented, or it's just a straw man. They're just responding to a straw man. We say at 124:34 in our video, I don't think anyone would justify the extermination order. Right. So, and then at 125:51, so just a minute later, so I don't think by adding these historical details, we are in any way justifying the extermination order.
It doesn't sound like we're justifying the extermination order, Kolby.
Yeah, and one of us says in response to the other one, no, I don't think anyone would. At 126:16, and we are not here to justify what Sidney Rigdon said either.
That was me.
All of those statements show that we were not justifying this at all. We were talking about how the reality of the historical narrative is much more complicated than the whitewashed version that Jacob presented to Alex. That was our entire point. Let's see how they represent it.
Easy things people are saying. Jared, I figured we just start right with this doozy. You and Emerson both said you wanted to comment on this one, and so I have a clip here. I think we're just going to start with the one that I think is just the most glorious, that shows how incredibly unhinged, especially RFM is. I think Kolby's actually can be somewhat reasonable, but like RFM is just a lunatic, and I think this clip really showcases that well. So let me go ahead and pull this up. Let me share it. Let me just make sure. Hold on a second. I'm going to actually stop sharing that for a second. I'm going to reshare. I just want to make sure. Share the audio. Yes. Okay. I just want to make sure the audio is going to be shared with this. Okay. I'll go full screen.
That out.
And this is them talking about the extermination order.
Well put. Number 9, we got 24 of these slides. Number 9 is the extermination order. He's going to try and get a little persecution card played for the Mormons and how the extermination order was issued by Governor Lilburn Boggs of Missouri in October of 1838. And this, of course, is going to get some sympathy. It always does. But he's not going to mention, Jacob will not mention, that in July of 1838, the Mormons are the ones who started it by
Hold on,
Why
let's
won't you
continue.
mention this, huh? Why won't
Hold
you
on, hold on.
Jacob?
I don't know why that we started it or Sidney Rigdon started it.
Okay, now, of course, in the context, the starting it is starting the talk of extermination. The context is starting it is the talk of extermination, which is why Jacob has to do such a hard cut there.
Mm-hmm. So
And did, and it was published that the Mormons would exterminate all the non-Mormons in the state if they got in their way. Okay. And now Jacob, of course, is going to seize upon that as if I had said that the Mormons started the Mormon War in Missouri.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't play their fuller commentary where they call us they already did call us unhinged and lunatics.
But I'm more unhinged than you are.
I was going to say one of us more than the other.
And there's only one lunatic here today.
The reason I didn't play the full clip is because they are quite literally responding to a straw man. We'll play what we actually said on the next slide. Before you do, the one thing I wanted to note is that they also make a big deal about how the way you had cut Sidney Rigdon's statement left off the very next sentence.
Oh, right.
Anytime you're selecting quotes for people who have never done this before, anytime you're selecting quotes, you grapple with what do I include versus what do I not include. That's why I sometimes probably belabor the point too much of, hey, I just cut this at this place so that people can't make that accusation. But their entire big point is that Sidney Rigdon in the very next sentence says, we will never be the aggressors or something to that effect.
Which is what all aggressors say.
Which is,
I mean,
completely ignores.
Don't all aggressors say we will never be the aggressors?
Well, my overall point too is just, do they think that just because someone says something that means that it's true? Because the bottom line is, at the same time Sidney Rigdon made that speech, the Danites were organized and were doing Danite things. And so
it's true.
even if that wasn't true, the fact that Sidney says that doesn't necessarily make it true, but they seem to just think that we were up to hiding the fact that Sidney said that. We weren't, guys. Okay, Sidney said that. Now, do you want to have a conversation about what the Danites were doing while Sidney said that? Because I'm not sure that really helps your argument all that much.
No, because we didn't bring it up. They didn't clip it, so he's not going to respond to it. Once again, this is the same thing he's doing with our show as he did to Alex about Mormonism.
Just in reverse.
He's not going to give you the information that will prove he's wrong, even though he knows it.
Right.
He'll wait for the other side to bring it up, and then if he is going to deign to address it, then he will have his fallback position.
Right.
Well, Joseph Smith wasn't involved in the Danites. There's nothing bad in Joseph Smith's church history that Joseph Smith was ever involved in, according to the apologists, just so you know.
Right.
He was never there when all the bad stuff was going down. So here is what we really said.
Yeah, you put this together.
That's right. And it actually has some of that tape from the transcript you read there.
If you bring to the table. So I don't think by adding these details, we're in any way justifying the extermination order. I don't think anyone would. I don't think anyone would justify the things, the horrors and abuses that the saints suffered leaving Missouri. You're still muted, so I'm just going to keep talking.
God damn it. No. Hopefully I'll remember to come back and edit that. If not, we'll get a surprise. But and we're not here to justify what Sidney Rigdon said either.
Right. The bottom line is that the narrative is much more complicated than the whitewashed version that apologists tell outsiders, which is we were so picked on for our beliefs that the government literally was hunting us like rats in a field. That is not the truth.
Because of our beliefs.
Because of our belief. That is not the truth. The reality is that the political difficulties and the difficulties they were facing because of Joseph Smith and other church leaders' violation of laws at that time was because of things that the saints had done to start many of these battles, right? Joseph had made political alliances with people that then he hadn't followed through on, basically promising that the Mormons would vote as a bloc. It gets very complicated. Our only point,
I think that was more in Illinois, but they had trouble wherever they went.
Yes, I was going to say that was more in Illinois, but they also had problems with being in Missouri and the whole situation with slavery and the Missouri Compromise from 1820.
Well, they're letting out that they're going to be taking over the entire state, and it's going to become Zion, and they're going to bring all the Mormons there, and everybody else can go find someplace else to live because we've got dibs.
Right. And the bottom line is just the narrative of what happened with the Missouri Mormon War is not right from, I think, really either perspective. I think it's regrettable, everything that happened. And I feel terrible for those early saints who were trusting in Joseph and the other church leaders to lead them. But the bottom line is the narrative is vastly more complicated than the persecution narrative that Jacob's presenting, that we were just so picked on.
Yeah. The amazing thing is that we actually said all of that in a rather prolonged piece from the episode that Jacob is now criticizing, as if we never said any of that.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't play it. And he's got two other guys with him who, at least one of whom, apparently, I think both of whom claim to have watched it and don't call him on this.
Yep.
So there you go. we try to be careful, and it's always easy to misquote somebody or quote them out of context, to straw man, to mischaracterize, to attempt to deceive, as Jacob is wont to do. But if he's going to do it to Mormonism, I feel honored that he will do it to us as well. And there we go. That's our one example. I don't think there's any better example I could come up with than a straw man argument like Jacob did to us.
Yeah, that's a great example.
He really had to go out of his way to straw man that argument.
I was trying to get all three of me on the screen at the same time to be nodding along at the same time. I think that would have been real fantastic.
I just wanted all of you to be wearing flannel, the same flannel shirt. I was sitting here thinking the same thing. I was thinking how nice it is to be sitting here watching me.
For what it's worth, I don't think I've ever talked about this on an episode, but that episode that where Jacob called us psychotic, unhinged lunatics. My wife and I were actually out of town the week he released that episode, the weekend he released that episode. And when we came back, even though I'm not blaming this on Jacob explicitly, I want to be real clear about that. So I'm sure I'll be strawmanned given the clip you just played. But when we came home, we've lived in this house for 12, 13 years, never had any property damage ever. And when we came home, our mailbox was smashed up with a baseball bat. And
Jacob.
I said it wasn't Jacob's fault. My point is that maybe people need to be a little bit more careful about the stuff they say online and misrepresent people's positions because it can have real world effects. There are people who listen to that strain of Mormon apologists that have engaged in some pretty unhinged behavior towards our mutual friend Cultural Hall. And anyways, I just have never talked about that publicly, but since it was linked with that episode, I thought I might mention it.
Good point. Any thoughts of you, Mr. Bell, before we go on to the next logical fallacy?
I've been taking notes. I'll bring them up because they fit into what I'm going to bring up later.
Okay, really good. So we've talked about the second one. So there's straw man. Now 3 is no true Scotsman. No true Scotsman. The no true Scotsman fallacy is really, really simple. And boy, it gets done all the time. It is amazing. It's almost as popular, maybe more popular than the Motte and Bailey fallacy in Mormonism. No true Scotsman comes from this basic idea that some Scotsman is talking about haggis, and he's talking about how all Scotsmen love haggis. And there's another Scotsman in the crowd. He says, well, excuse me, I'm a Scotsman, and I don't like haggis. Sorry, I totally butchered that one. But there's a Scotsman. He's really a Scotsman. Says, I don't like haggis. And the response is, okay, because he's given him now a counterexample that disproves his universal rule of all Scotsmen love haggis. So the response is, well, all true Scotsmen love haggis. So that's why it's defined as dismissing a counterexample by redefining a term in a way that excludes them. In other words, the person who's the counterexample. You hear this in the church as an example with anyone who leaves the church never really had a testimony. I think we've all heard that, haven't we? This is a way of saying that they were never true Mormons, and no true Mormon ever leaves the church. This allows apologists to preserve the idea that a true testimony never fails by redefining it after the fact. So here's a few examples, okay? And I wanted to start with this one by Bruce R. McConkie from 1984, October General Conference, where he actually frames it in the form of a no true Scotsman fallacy. It was very kind of him. I was excited to find this. He says, no true Latter-day Saint. Do you hear the no true Scotsman fallacy in that? No true Latter-day Saint will ever take a stand that is in opposition to what the Lord has revealed to those who direct the affairs of his earthly kingdom.
Can I say something about this example?
Do it.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but this example resonated with me a lot when I was going through the slides because when I was on my mission, I got really close to a guy who was a sealer in the Mesa Temple. I was much closer to him than I was even to my mission president. I looked at him kind of as like a spiritual mentor. I was in his area for like 6 months. And then when I moved areas, he had actually moved and was in this new area. So I served around this guy for like a whole year of my 2-year mission. And fantastic, wonderful person. Love him to death. But I remember calling him when I was going through the events that happened in our local ward, and he hit me with a quote exactly like this, that it is God's place to correct the leaders of the church. It is not my place, and I was to say nothing. And so when I saw this in here, I can't remember if it was this quote exactly or a very similar sentiment expressed by someone else, but it really just, it still fills me with anger. It was the one time I even remember, because I was still in the believing camp at that point. I remember saying to him, I just do not believe that God would ask me to keep my mouth shut about something like this. That was where I think it became a real problem for me, was the ethics of it.
Yeah. Let me just add, one of the many things I love about you, Kolby, is that your leading example is just that child abuse. I was just having a debate with my own siblings this week because of my sister, who I love, sent out this Deseret News article to the family, which basically took to the $250 million in legal liability of the church for child abuse and explained it away with a hand wave kind of argument. And how just absolutely offensive that is. You know, you guys work in court, I work in court, we know how the courts work. And any verdict or settlement over $10 million, even in LA, even in New York, really raises eyebrows. When you're talking about $250 million in admitted liability for child sex abuse, that makes your head explode. Now, I know the Catholic Church is bigger, but on a per capita basis, Catholicism is gigantic and Mormonism is very, very, very tiny. So crunch the numbers on that. So I retaliated with my own family to her sending that propaganda around, frankly, the Deseret News nonsense, and said, how on earth can you sit on your hands with the issue of child abuse so looming and so large in the LDS Church? You know, I got lots of nieces and nephews that I love going to that church, and I would like them to be safe. And they all sat on their hands, just crickets, silence, no response. And I feel like you do, Kolby. I want to flip cars. I get so pissed off about it.
Okay. Well, thanks for adding that. Yeah. This is a very, very interesting point of view. And often this no true Scotsman fallacy ends up being used by people in authority to subjugate people to what they say. In other words, you follow me, you do what I say, or you're not a true whatever it happens to be. All right. And this is where he's trying to get people to not take opposition to the leaders of the church. And he does it by saying that no true Latter-day Saint would ever do such a thing. So if you're doing that, you're not a true Mormon. So get back in line, do what you're supposed to do. And here's another one from Bruce R. McConkie. Now, this is the one I had originally thought of. I found the other one by accident and very happily so. But this is what he talks about, the lectures on faith. He's talking about lecture 5, the one about the Godhead, which describes it completely differently from the way the Mormons believe it today.
RFM, I'm sorry. Randy's example prompted, if I can, before we go to another example.
Sure.
Randy's example of having that discussion with his family member, just and the way you drove that home really just reminded me. There's this great quote from Carl Sagan I wanted to share, and then I'll talk about how it connects to what Randy said. So in Demon Haunted World, Carl Sagan's 1996 book, he wrote, one of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It is simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. For once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never get it back. And I think what I wanted to say is I deal with those same emotions that Randy does. And I think that's where learning these critical thinking flaws, learning about these logical fallacies can help us have compassion for people who are still stuck in those traps in critical thinking, like these lapses in critical thinking, basically. Because I think Carl Sagan really drives that point home by saying, when you allow yourself to be sold these fallacies so regularly, like people in the church are raised on, it's hard for them to even see our perspective. And so that's why it matters. That's why critical thinking and learning about these logical fallacies matters, is so that you can see when a charlatan is trying to, like you said, RFM, claim that power over you. It is, the way you put it is perfect. This example is used so regularly to say, I know you think you're this, but you're actually not unless you do exactly what I say. And I think that really drives how people who are otherwise morally normal do things that are totally morally abhorrent without even realizing it. It's this slow compromise over time.
Great point. Thank you. Here's Bruce R. McConkie, and what he's doing is he's talking about this document that used to be in the Doctrine and Covenants that describes God in a different way that Mormons believe in him today, or the Godhead. All right. So we believe God has a body of flesh and bones, as tangible as man's, the Son also, the Holy Ghost is a spirit, personage of spirit. Okay. That's 1842 or 3 from Joseph Smith. It's what we believe today. In 1835 was published the Lectures on Faith with the Doctrine and Covenants. It was the Doctrine and the Doctrine and Covenants. And Lecture 5 described God as having a body of being a personage of spirit. Suddenly God the Father becomes what the Holy Ghost is later. But God the Father, personage of spirit. Jesus has a body of flesh and bones, and the Holy Ghost is not a personage at all. He is simply the mind that connects the two, Father and Son, the mind of God. So there's only 2 persons in the Godhead, and that's what it says in the Lectures on Faith. Now, what Bruce R. McConkie is trying to do to his audience here is say that actually the Lectures on Faith teaches exactly what we teach today. And he's not going to do a textual analysis of it to prove it. Instead, he's going to use this logical fallacy. And he's going to use it there in that highlighted part. It's the no true Scotsman fallacy. And he's going to say, if you don't understand that what I'm saying is true, that it really is exactly what we teach today, then you are not a true Scotsman or a true Mormon. Here's how he puts it there. To spiritually illiterate persons, as soon as you hear that, you know that this is a no true Scotsman fallacy, because what he's going to say is, if you don't agree with me, you're spiritually illiterate. To spiritually illiterate persons, it may seem hard and confusing. To those whose souls are aflame with heavenly light, this is the positive part, right? It is a nearly perfect summary of those things which must be believed to gain salvation. So if you believe what I'm telling you, your souls are aflame with heavenly light. If you don't, you're illiterate. So here's another example of the no true Scotsman fallacy being used by Bruce R. McConkie. So much of Mormonism is built on the no true Scotsman fallacy. I have Moroni's promise up here on the screen. We all know Moroni's promise, all right? It promises that a person who reads and prays about the Book of Mormon will receive a manifestation, a witness that it is true from the Holy Ghost, okay? And yet, embedded in this promise are all these caveats, all these conditions, all these ways you can screw it up. So that if you don't get your answer, then you are the one who was not true enough to all of these conditions. So this lays the groundwork for the no true Scotsman fallacy that will follow from anybody who's read the Book of Mormon and prayed about it and did not get the promised spiritual prompting. Well, you weren't true enough to these conditions, and you need to try again, because the fault is yours, not God's. If you do it right, it will work. So when you shall receive these things, it's Moroni 10:4, if you don't know, I would exhort you that you would ask God, the eternal Father, in the name of Christ. That's pretty easy. If these things are not true, and if you shall ask with a sincere heart, with real intent, having faith in Christ, he will manifest the truth of it unto you. So there's 3 conditions right there that are very nebulous and hard to define. But if you don't get your answer, that's why, because you were not true enough in the way that you followed this promise. Faith to be healed is the same thing. When a priesthood blessing does not work, which occasionally happens in the Mormon church, by the way, folks, I hate to break it to you. Every now and then a priesthood blessing does not work. It's common to hear excuses. And the 2 most common excuses are the person being blessed didn't have enough faith, or the person blessing didn't have enough faith. So both of these are variations of the no true Scotsman logical fallacies, because somebody wasn't true enough for the healing to happen.
That
Yes.
that example, similar to how I shared one of the reasons I think the Motte and Bailey is so problematic, the way it can be received. This idea of having like qualifications on faith or conditions related on faith, the first thing I'd say is you can see how easily you can link that idea with Joseph Smith's folk magic treasure digging activities in the early 1820s, that he often did the exact same thing, right? There were all these conditions placed on these magic spells. You didn't kill the animal correctly. You didn't draw the line correctly. There's always some ability to explain why it didn't work, and it's never the fault of the seer. It's always the fault of the fault of the person receiving it, not the fart of the person receiving it. But when we talk about faith not to be healed, and the way you put it, that the person giving the blessing didn't have enough faith. I don't even think I've told you the story before, RFM, but so I served my mission in Tempe, Arizona, and I was out with a ward mission leader right at the very beginning of my mission. And I was, I had that like greeny zeal. I think I was out like 3 months, and I was so excited to be there, and I was so excited to be teaching people. And I was teaching this lesson with this ward mission leader to someone who was blind. And I remember just feeling so overwhelmed with compassion towards this person that it was like, if I could have done anything to give this man his sight back, I would have done it, right? That was what I was feeling in that moment. Didn't say anything about it. I didn't like offer to bless him. But I remember when we left the lesson that this ward mission leader talked to me and asked me if I was feeling an impression to offer him, to give him a blessing to restore his sight. And I said, yeah, I was in that moment, because of course I was confusing my compassion for this person and all of the difficulties that dealing with that disability was bringing to his life and his family for a legitimate spiritual impression. And I was castigated by this ward mission leader for lacking the faith to offer the blessing. And what I want to say is the harm that people receive by this behavior, this no true Scotsman behavior, I internalized that and made that about me being a bad missionary and me lacking faith, when I think all three of us know that if I had offered to restore that man's sight through a blessing, exactly how that would have shaken out. And so that's one of the reasons that this logical fallacy in particular can be so damaging to people on the ex-Mormon side, is their faith, their legitimacy, their experience in the church is often questioned to allow the church to conveniently maintain its ideological purity or its escape from these, from these cases that would prove the rule false.
Very good. Anything from you, Randy, on that?
Excuse me. Well, that just kind of, I happen to have right here an article titled Benny Hinn, Healer or Hypnotist, and which RFM and I are going to be addressing at a future date. And by the way, Benny Hinn lives right down the street. That's
a nice neighborhood.
What's that?
That's a nice neighborhood then.
He lives on the rich side of the street. But yeah, I don't know. I just pointed out, I want to second everything you just said, Kolby, without going into a tangent.
I don't know if you live on the poor side of the street when I can see 2 ceiling fans, Dr. Bell.
On the other side of the street, they have 3.
$300 a piece at Home Depot, so you can be rich too.
I'm just teasing you.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So patriarchal blessings as well. Patriarchal blessing is an entire exercise in a no true Scotsman fallacy. Because on the one hand, and this is also Motte and Bailey here, but here's Thomas S. Monson talking about patriarchal blessings in a way that we've all heard. He says, your patriarchal blessing is your passport to peace in this life. It is a liahona of light to guide you unerringly to your heavenly home. Wow. What a great thing a patriarchal blessing is. And then over here, you also hear this. So this is from William James Mortimer. The fulfillment of patriarchal blessings, as of all divine promises, is conditioned on the faith and works of the individual. So your patriarchal blessing will only become operative if you are a true Mormon. And if you're not a true Mormon, then you've got no guarantee. Actually, find out later on in the fine print, even if you're a true Mormon, there's no guarantee it's going to happen in this life either. That's the really sad part.
You can see how they try and build the out if the promises don't come true, right? But some promises have to do with, so my patriarchal blessing says that I am literally a descendant of Joseph who was sold into Egypt. I have run my genetic ancestry. I have absolutely no Semitic DNA or link to Egypt, even at the trace DNA level. And so it's funny that even as they try and build these outs, some patriarchs still step over the line and say things that they probably shouldn't.
Well, they still think they're living in a world of unfalsifiability, and actually they're not anymore as that goes. That's interesting. All right, so we've done the first 3. Now false dichotomy. Okay, this is my 4th and last one. Presenting 2 options as the only possibilities when others exist. Now, That's a bell curve I put on here, this diagram. We all know what a bell curve is. We all understand that generally, whatever the category is, you're going to have the most people in the middle, right? And then it's going to filter out, and only on the ends are you going to have the extremes. And those are the smallest groups of people, right? They're outliers. As a general rule, when we're talking about things like this, we understand that the truth is probably going to be more in the middle. And so, I mean, there are entire philosophies that are built upon this, the middle way, right? Going through the middle, not being on either extreme. So on the one hand, we understand that that is frequently helpful and valid, but the false dichotomy logical fallacy tries to get us to reverse that in our heads and to get us to agree that the only possibilities of finding the truth are not in the middle, but are on either extreme. And it's frequently put that way, on either extreme, in order to force somebody onto the side of that, the radical side of it that you want them to go to, by painting the other extreme in a negative way. Example, either Joseph Smith was a prophet or he was a fraud. This ignores more nuanced possibilities. For example, self-deception, charismatic belief, and mixed motives. This is also called the fallacy of the excluded middle. And when I draw the diagram, it's pretty easy to see why the middle is being excluded. We want to keep the middle, but if you use this fallacy, you don't get to even know it's there. And that's the beauty of it. So you got Gordon B. Hinckley with the famous quote, "Our whole strength rests on the validity of Joseph Smith's first vision. It either occurred or it did not occur." See the false dichotomy. If it did not, then this work is a fraud. If it did, then it is the most important and wonderful work under the heavens.
Let me pause you for a second. So
Yeah.
the first sentence, it either occurred or it did not occur, that is a true dichotomy.
That's true.
Yes, that is a true dichotomy. It either did occur or it did not occur. The second one, it's interesting that he has a true dichotomy and then a false dichotomy right after it. It shows a really good example of what's legitimate thinking and what's fallacious thinking.
Okay, very good. Here's another one from Joseph Fielding Smith. "Mormonism, as it is called, must stand or fall on the story of Joseph Smith." So this wasn't original to Gordon B. "He was either a prophet of God, divinely called, properly appointed and commissioned, or he was one of the biggest frauds this world has ever seen. There is no middle ground." So that's Joseph Fielding Smith. No middle ground. And I think, once again, that's a false dichotomy. But once again, it's designed in order to get the audience to go where you're going with, which is he's a prophet. Because if he's not a prophet, he's a fraud. He's one of the most horrible people that you've ever seen, and you wouldn't even cross the street to shake his hand. So that's how they're trying to get you to go with the prophet as opposed to the fraud. Now, Joseph Fielding Smith did this also with evolution. He said, if evolution is true, the church is false. Okay.
Whoops.
If evolution is true, the church is false. Right. And that's in Doctrines of Salvation.
Why do you think he would say that, Randy?
What?
Since you said whoops, why do you think he would say that?
Yeah, I just read a book called The Language of God by Francis Collins. And Francis Collins is arguably the brightest scientist alive. Institute of Health. He's a big deal. And and he went from atheist to Christian, and he knows more about the topic of DNA than probably anybody on the planet. He led the whole Human Genome Project, and he says, as a scientist and as a Christian, that evolution is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm laughing.
I see. Okay. Well, here we got Joseph Fielding Smith not taking that position, but he's saying if evolution is true, the church is false. And I read the book. Okay, I read his what is it? His Eternal Destiny. I'm not getting it exactly right, but it's his book about evolution and why it's true. His Origin and Destiny, I'll bet is what it is.
Yep.
So what Joseph Fielding Smith believed, based on my recollection of reading his book, was that the fall was necessary to account for man's fallen or depraved state, and that Jesus was needed to redeem mankind. And so if you've got no fall, then there's no need for Jesus. There's no need for the atonement. And if there's if there's evolution, then there's no fall. Okay. So I think that's what he was actually packing into this when he says, if evolution is true, the church is false. And I agreed with him for a while, and then I started thinking about it over time, and I thought, well, wait a second. What if mankind was depraved due to some other reason than taking literally the account of the fall? Is there some other reason that we're all such no good so-and-sos? What if mankind needed to be redeemed from the carnal nature, but that nature did not come because of the fall? See, there are other things that you can start coming up with if you don't allow yourself to go along with this idea of the excluded middle or the false dichotomy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's what I did. Now, this is the last thing I have for my 4 things. Okay. And this is a great, great clip because everybody here is going to know this clip. I think it's Elder Holland from General Conference, October 2009. He's talking about the Book of Mormon, crawling around or under or over. We don't quite get to that part. But notice that this entire segment of his talk is based upon this logical fallacy of the excluded middle or the false dichotomy. And this false dichotomy is based upon that either Joseph Smith was a fraud or not. And if he were a fraud, he would not have died in Carthage. He would not have had the Book of Mormon read to him by Hiram in Carthage, not long, the day before, I think it was, before he died. He's not going to talk about Hiram reading Josephus or drinking wine. They never do. But he is going to make an extended and passionate argument based entirely upon, I believe, the logical fallacy here of the excluded middle, or I'm just having a mind blank on the real name, the false dichotomy. There it is, the false dichotomy. So let me go ahead and play this. I'm going to take this one off the screen, put on the other one, and here it is, and listen to this and see if you can hear it now yourself.
A few short verses from the 12th chapter of Ether in the Book of Mormon. Before closing the book, Hiram turned down the corner of the page from which he had read, marking it as part of the everlasting testimony for which these 2 brothers were about to die. I hold in my hand that book, the very copy from which Hiram read, the same corner of the page turned down, still visible. Later, when actually incarcerated in the jail, Joseph the prophet turned to the guards who held him captive and bore a powerful testimony of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon.
Here it comes.
Shortly thereafter, pistol and ball would take the lives of these 2 testators. As one of 1,000 elements of my own testimony of the divinity of the Book of Mormon, I submit this as yet one more evidence of its truthfulness. In this, their greatest and last hour of need, I ask you, would these men blaspheme before God by continuing to fix their lives, their honor, and their own search for eternal salvation on a book, and by implication, a church and a ministry they had fictitiously created out of whole cloth? Never mind that their wives are about to be widows and their children fatherless. Never mind that their little band of followers will yet be houseless, homeless, and friendless, and that their children will leave footprints of blood across frozen rivers and an untamed prairie floor. Never mind that legions will die and other legions live, declaring in the 4 quarters of this earth that they know the Book of Mormon and the church which it espouses it to be true. Disregard all of that and tell me whether in this hour of death these 2 men would enter the presence of their eternal judge, quoting from and finding solace in a book, which, if not the very word of God, would brand them as impostors and charlatans until the end of time. They would not do that. They were willing to die rather than deny the divine origin and the eternal truthfulness of the Book of Mormon.
I'm not sure they had a lot of time to deny it when the mob showed up, but that is an extended argument based upon the fallacy of the excluded middle, of the either or, of the now I'm doing it to myself, I'm afraid.
False dichotomy.
Thank you, the false dichotomy. See, I'm doing this on purpose to make everybody else out there feel better about not being able to remember all the names of these logical fallacies. Even Radio Free Mormon can't. And I'm only dealing with 4, and I'm the one who came up with these 4. So that is, and everybody remembers that. So that's my last one. What do you think about that as an example, that Elder Holland example, as an extended argument based upon the fallacy of a false dichotomy?
Go ahead, Randy.
Well, I think that Holland espouses not just a false dichotomy. I mean, it's kind of in a weird way, it's kind of a straw man, because he talks about it as if these guys know they're going to their death. They didn't know they were going to their death. They were going to jail because Joseph Smith, first of all, fled across the Mississippi River. And then, and this is part of my Bell family legacy, but my great-great-grandfather took his boat over and got him and brought him back. And then they went by horseback to Carthage. But they were, he's running, but he's kind of in a box. He's out of options. And I don't think he, knew he was going to his death. So it's the story. I mean, if you went through Holland's, transcript of what he said line by line, it's riddled with logical fallacies. That's just another one.
Right. And so he's intentionally excluding the other options. And that's one of the first ones, right? It depends on that Joseph Smith knew he was going to his death. And there's nothing to indicate that other than what was written into the record after the fact about how he knew he was going like a lamb to the slaughter.
Yeah. The other, it also just ignores. So, and I think you highlighted this when you were first talking about this fallacy, RFM. They're using your inability, especially when you're raised in the church and you're raised with such sensitive feelings about Joseph Smith. Like you literally sing a hymn called Praise to the Man from the time you're a little child, like I did. And so you're faced with this false choice of either saying he was a fraud or he must be a prophet. Sometimes if you're in a doubting phase, right, you might not be comfortable with saying he is a prophet. I believe he is a prophet, but it's much harder to say, okay, I believe he was a fraud. And that's how this fallacy can trap people, is especially when you're raised in a world where you have to believe such strong things about this particular person. It can be so hard for you to throw those feelings out the window. The reason that it's so problematic too is that it just ignores the reality that people go to their deaths being sincerely mistaken every single day. Where I live in Idaho, one county over, there's a community of Christian scientists that don't believe in even like basic medicine. Like I'm talking Tylenol for their children. There are about a dozen children that die in this community every single year. There have been documentaries done on it. The parents that allow their children to die without basic medical care, they're not doing those things because they hate their children. They're doing those things because they sincerely believe in their beliefs. And Holland's message completely ignores that possibility that Joseph and Hiram may have been legitimately mistaken, or in like Dan Vogel's pious fraud theory, believed that even their lies were justified because they were, in an ends justify the means kind of way, bringing more people to Christ. It ignores that possibility, which I think is actually probably the more likely explanation for this.
Thank you very much. There's my first 4. So now we're going to go to the next set of 4, which starts with ad hominem.
Yes, I guess that's me. Ad hominem attacks are basically name calling. It's attacking the person instead of their argument. So when you guys were called, and I wrote this down, spiritual, or no, well, Holland just said spiritually illiterate. Who said spiritually illiterate?
McConkie.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, getting back to you guys, psychotic, unhinged lunatics. There's another example of an ad hominem attack. And basically, when you resort to that, you're out of arguments. And so you're just name calling and you've officially lost the argument. So thank you, Jacob Hansen, for a perfect lead in to talking about ad hominem attacks because you just lost the debate. So anyway, and there's an example here. John DeLynn is just bitter and wants to tear the church down. I don't think I've been with John many times. He's not bitter at all. He's actually a fun guy. So I think we've talked more about the intro. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so there's a missing piece art here, but artwork.
And that was
here,
the best part. The part that's black, it didn't transfer over. That was the best part of all the slides.
Yeah. Okay. So here's a how-to guide to do ad hominem. First, ignore the argument. So no matter what's said, just ignore it. Number two, attack the person instead of the argument. Number three, make the person on the other side of the argument look bad. Number four, claim victory over the argument. And then step five is do a victory dance. That's exactly how it goes down. And I'm really trying to get out of this bad habit, but I get on these Facebook debates all the time, and these debates have become so predictable that I'm kind of getting tired of it. But somebody will say something, Ipse dixit, and we're about to talk about what that is, just some statement about the church being so wonderful. And I will respond by simply quoting something from the church's own website. And then I get a response back saying, I'm evil and I'm a liar, when all I did was quote from the church's own website, like literally. And so and then I respond, well, look, you've automatically lost the argument. That's an ad hominem attack. You never actually addressed the issue. And I did by quoting your own church's website. And then I never hear from them again. So that's kind of how it goes down. So let's go to the next slide.
I want to tell you right now, I don't have it on a slide, but this reminds me of this hysterical thing I saw, I think for the first time yesterday. It happened, it was on the internet. It's like, messages, people talking back and forth. And I don't know on what form, but it was March, it was 2020, COVID is just hitting. And there is a person who is talking, they're comparing COVID, which is reality, with the Stephen King novel, The Stand, where they had a massive, release of a toxin, and it killed almost everybody. More than 99% of everybody in the world got killed by this. All right. So there's one person who's trying to say COVID is not as bad as The Stand. Okay. So what you need to do is you just need to calm down. You need to practice, regular, washing hands and let's just basic safety, and we'll all get through this. And then another person responds to that first person saying, you don't know what you're talking about. Have you even read the book? Now, the funny thing is that the first person who's saying that it's not as bad, COVID is not as bad as in The Stand, it's actually Stephen King. Stephen King is actually saying it's not as bad as in The Stand. And you got some other crackpot going, you don't know what you're talking about. Have you even read the book?
That's awesome.
So that kind of thing. Okay. So let's go ahead. We'll put something else up here. Let me see. Add to the stage. Ad hominem. Did you want to say anything else more about this slide?
Not me. Kolby, you have anything to say about that?
Well, the only thing I'd say, just because sometimes RFM and I, when we're having these live conversations, especially about Austin or Jacob or Ward Radio, sometimes we will also use some jokey, sarcastic names. And I think ad hominem needs to be understood that it's fallacious when you're substituting insults for argument. When you're in the heat of an argument, sometimes also maybe commenting on someone's quality of thinking. It's fallacious when it's substituted for argument, not just when someone may use a name.
Right. Ad hominem is not an insult only. It is an insult that is used in order to get you to not believe what the other party says because of the insult. So you're attacking the person, not the argument. So in other words, when I call Jacob Hansen a douche canoe, okay, that's an insult. It's not an ad hominem, because I'm not saying don't believe him because he's a douche canoe. I show you the reasons to not believe him, and I show you the receipts. Douche canoe is just a personal feeling that I have about Jacob Hansen. It's simply an insult. It's not an ad hominem. So there is a difference.
You know, I'm laughing, but you're actually right. You know, if you, I mean, it's one, insults are one thing, I suppose, but if you follow up whatever you have to say with evidence, then it's not an ad hominem. But when I'm called evil and a liar with no basis, another response I give is, wonderful. Tell me what lie I told. And I've been in hundreds of these debates on Facebook. I'm going to stop doing it. But I've never had one of them actually address a lie I have supposedly told, other than I'm a liar. So,
yes.
Anyway, moving on.
So here's some what are these ad hominems that we've heard in the church?
Yeah, these are ad hominems. Lazy learners. Russell M. Nelson, lazy learners and lax disciples will only struggle to muster a particle of faith. So
wait, that says lazy leaners.
Oh, well, that's because I can't spell.
I think a leaner is by definition lazy. You just need to stand up straight. Quit leaning, okay?
Leaners? Oh, the title. How'd that happen? Anyway,
I don't know.
I can't spell.
I'm just glad you didn't put
please,
wiener.
to move on from my lousy spelling.
It
You know,
could
if
have
you
been
can't
lazy
think
wiener.
of more than one way to spell a word, you lack imagination. That's how I roll.
Well, there's a few here, and you spell all these right, I'm sure.
Probably not. But, you know, RFM, I'm going to just tell you, I love you, buddy, but you have two choices in life. Correct grammar or have friends.
I choose grammar.
All right. I'm kidding around. All right. So one night, I swear, my brain is so strange. I woke up at 3 a.m. and I was upset about being called something by somebody when I left the church. And I got this idea in my head. You know, we get called a lot of names when we leave the church. You know, of course, there's apostate, there's A. And I thought, I wonder if I can fill out the whole library, or the whole alphabet. I mean, I wonder if you can fill out the whole alphabet with insults that I have personally heard describing those who have left the church. And one of the interesting things about leaving the church is when you leave, you know, without any doubt and with every fiber of your being, you're going to be called all kinds of things by people that were once your besties, you know. So, take a look. Anti-Mormon, apostate. I'm not anti-Mormon. I love Mormons. I'm not so hot on Mormonism, and there's a key difference. Awful, bad, blinded, bitter fruit, do any of these names kind of pop off the list for you guys?
Did you just put cockroaches in there? Because that's a new one.
I know. I just updated this slide. Yes, I just added that, and now I got to add psychotic, unhinged, lunatic. I got 3 more. I'm gonna go off the page.
And rando. Don't forget rando.
Making a note right now.
Rando's a good one. You're going to be able to do a complete dictionary.
Yeah.
One of the things I love about the ex-Mormon experience and the ex-Mormon community is we're often able to take these labels and use them as badges of honor amongst ourselves, like lazy learners. There's so many times I've cracked that joke about RFM when he rattles off some obscure fact of church history or knowledge of some obscure talk, because the truth is when their arguments just amount to mudslinging and name calling, the best thing we can do is just, like, it doesn't matter, they can call us whatever they want and it really doesn't matter. So I like when we own those labels and turn them into a sarcastic compliment. I think that's the best response we can do.
Yeah, that's good, Kolby. And another approach is, when I get called a name, I say, well, I probably, take one off the list. Maybe I am a patty cake taffy puller. Can you show the evidence to back that up? And again, crickets. So, you know, I kind of welcome the thing to say, hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I am one of these things, but where's your evidence? What did I say that was a lie? What did I say that was incorrect? Where did I get a date wrong? You know, show me the evidence. But until you do, you've lost the argument.
Very good. Oh, I put this in here because this just seemed to be a very recent example about John Dehlin getting trashed in a very ad hominem kind of way in the Deseret News of all places. It was an article. It was from May 31st of this year, 2025. Maybe male critics are not experts on religious women's underclothing. This is written by Megan Kohler. And what happened was, I think it was the New York Times that published an article about the new garment or something like that. And they went to John Dehlin and got a comment from him talking about how all the women that he has interviewed, vast majority have reservations about wearing the garment. Okay. So this is what this lady says, who's writing the article in order to get you to discount what it is that John Dehlin had to say. She says, to that end, John Dehlin, a former member, there's the first thing, who podcasts criticisms of the church, is asked to weigh in on Latter-day Saint women's feelings. Quote, I would say close to all of them express significant discomfort, if not aversion to wearing garments, period, end of quote. Now, this seems a bit like asking Martin Luther how Catholics feel about the Pope. Unless there is some compelling reason to believe Dehlin's ongoing criticism of the institutional church is not coloring his perception of how its members feel, sourcing him here is mind-bogglingly weird. So can you see there how ad hominem and calling John Dehlin names is used as a substitute for addressing his arguments?
That's a beautiful example. I mean, I remember meeting John years and years ago when I first left the church. And I think the first thing we talked about was him kind of suggesting, hey, do you really want to leave the church? Can you keep it working because of the structure it offers? I mean, John's the first to point out the church has great structure. It does a number of good things. He was not trying to talk me out of the church. I can tell you that. I'm the one that said, no, I can't, I can't make this work. There's no way to make this work. So that's just so wrong on so many levels.
Well, and that, maybe not with John. I mean, I did have that experience with John too, Randy, but I was also going to point out RFM. I know that's a big thing for you. You don't tell people to leave the church. I remember talking to you when we first became friends right after I'd appeared on Mormon Stories, and I'm kind of still grappling with what I want to do with the church, because my wife and I had been going to church like literally weeks before we went on Mormon Stories. So that was kind of rare. And that's when RFM and I connected. I can't even really remember how, but I remember talking to you a lot during that phase. And there was not one time you ever said to me, leave the church, or felt like it was your place to dictate my life's decisions, unlike what the church does.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad you remembered that. I don't remember that, but it sounds like me.
Well, it's brilliant, so take credit. You know, I was just in Greece, and Bart Ehrman led a small tour. And one of the things I noticed about Bart Ehrman is that, and by the way, just so people who don't know, Bart Ehrman is arguably the best critical scholar of the Bible on the planet. He's written about 6 New York Times bestselling books on the topic, and he's a professor on the topic. And he's also an atheist. But what I noticed about Bart is that there was quite a spectrum of people in the room or on the tour. It went from 3 to 10 people. It was a small group, but you had everything from really angry atheists to a guy who was really a ardent believer. Maybe he's kind of coming down from another high demand religion, but still, very, very wrapped up. And but good guy. Everybody's good, wonderful people. But Bart made it safe for everybody in the spectrum. And I happen to know that he counseled with the guy who was a believer and gave him reasons to believe. John Dehlin kind of does the same thing. RFM, you and I have had a lot of conversations where you've really helped me structure my worldview. So that's more the relevant issue, is accommodating a place that everybody's welcome to the table. And John DeLynn is one of those people, and these criticisms just don't apply to him. I can tell you, I can testify that that's not true. Anyway, next point, Ipse dixit. Let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about what that is.
Ipse dixit.
Yeah, sounds like a bad country song, but, and I cannot, I'm sorry, I cannot, can you read that, RFM, please?
You mean the country song by the Ipse Dixit Chicks?
That's the one.
Okay. So this is number 6. Critical thinking. Ipse Dixit, an argument based solely on one statement and based on no evidence. It means I said so because I said so. Bob said the Warthogs are the best team in the universe. In the universe. I was going to say university. In the universe. Sally asked for evidence to back his claim up. Right. Because we need more than just your say so. Okay.
Yeah. And so it's basically, I said so. And we see a lot of that, not just in the church, but in the world, where people will just make this statement and it's not backed up. And my response is, well, that's interesting. Where's your evidence to back that up? And then again, crickets. But I want to show some examples of that. Anything
Randy?
from you, Colby, before we move on?
Yeah, Randy, I think we're going to have to stop saying crickets for this silence that follows something and just start saying cockroaches.
The only thing I would say is, so there are these different epistemological razors. Most people are familiar with Occam's razor, right? The simplest explanation is usually the best. And we'll actually talk about that when we get to my portion of the slides. But Christopher Hitchens, his famous razor is that which can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. So that's known as Hitchens' razor. And I think it exists to cut through these arguments by assertion that you're talking about here, Randy.
Yeah.
And by the way, really quickly, that happens in the law too. If an attorney makes an assertion, a legal assertion in their brief, and does not back it up with citation to authority, the court will dismiss it out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
You have to support your argument with citations and sources. Otherwise, the judge dismisses it out of hand.
Mm-hmm. It's one of the reasons, I think it's one of the reasons that the critical thinking and thinking about the world through that lens of evidence was so foundational to my experience having entered this field. RFM is my first internship, and then my first job after I graduated was working for the judiciary. And so you learn that skill in that. You're taught very strict rules about if it's not cited, you need to go double check and find evidence for that proposition if it exists. But otherwise, you can basically just dismiss it out of hand and consider like it's not there. If there's an assertion of fact or an assertion of a proposition of law and it is not cited, the typical rule in the courts is it basically is like it. You might not have even put the sentence in the brief if you don't back it up with a citation.
Right. And of course, usually something is not backed up by citation is because there isn't a citation to back it up.
Yeah.
Who's this guy, Randy?
I'll just add to that, from my perspective, you guys are attorneys. I'm on the witness stand. So you guys have the easy job of asking questions and I have the tough job of answering them. But
that's why you get paid the big bucks.
Huh?
That's why you get paid the big bucks.
Well, we deserve it. So my point is that in the expert report, there are sections where, and I'm not talking figuratively or anecdotally, literally every single sentence is cited, so I couldn't agree more with you, Colby. You got to back up what you say with independent, published, peer-reviewed literature. All right, so going back to the slides.
Who's this guy?
This is from Heaven's Gate. This is the guy, Doe, who ran the Heaven's Gate cult. And I want to use him as an example, and I think it will become clear why as we play that. Can you go ahead and play that video, RFM?
Wait a second. This is a video to be played?
It should be, yeah.
Okay, hang on just a second here. I had skipped down to somebody else. I didn't realize.
I'm pretty sure it imported as just a photo.
Oh.
No, I'm just seeing that's just a photo.
Well, that's okay. I have a plan B. Go to the next slide.
Okay.
And Colby, would you mind reading that?
No problem. I hope for your sake you will at least ponder this. Don't ask your neighbors, your friends, what they think of this. Instead, go into the privacy of your closet and see if you can connect with the purest, highest source that you might consider God, and ask, what about this? Is this information for real? Is this for me? If it is, then please give me the strength I need to pursue it. He's got real crazy eyes, I have to tell you.
Indeed, he does. And that you were quoting Marshall Applewhite, who was the head of the Heaven's Gate cult. This was one of my cases. And what's interesting about it is that at the time I worked on this case, which I think was 1994, somewhere right. No, 95.
It was at least 95. It was probably into 96, maybe.
Yeah,
when
I think
this
you're
whole
right.
happened. Whole thing happened.
I think you're right. I think it was 95 or 96. Anyway, I was a TBM. I was a true believing Mormon. And I was going through the police videos and listening to all of their doctrines and listening to all their beliefs. And I came across this, and for reasons that I think that are obvious, this really stuck out. And it kind of stung, honestly, because this is right out of the Mormon missionary playbook, to pray about it. This is a perfect quintessential example of egos, logos, pathos, and duos, where everything's eliminated except for pathos, emotion, and basing your entire worldview and your entire life and all your discretionary time and all your discretionary money into a high demand religion. And it's based solely upon feelings you get with when you pray about the Book of Mormon. And that can be a very large discussion. Now, I happen to know a pastor here in Orange County, and he says, don't listen to your feelings. You can get good feelings from a burrito. You got to look at the evidence, and you should base your decisions upon solid, good research. That's a far more sensible way about looking at things. What do you guys think?
I think that that's the only way you can know if a burrito is true.
Kolby, can you top that one?
Nope, I'm not even going to try.
So this is
Right.
Pray about it, and it's under Ipse dixit. Okay. But he's not saying take my word for it. He's saying go and ask God. Is that different?
Well, he's basically saying it's true because I said it's true. And I get your point. This is kind of a slightly different argument. But when you listen to Jeffrey Holland and say, well, rest on my testimony until you get your own, that's definitely Ipse dixit. Or when you just hear, I know the church is true, those testimonies, that's definitely Ipse dixit. Whereas basically, I said so, I testified to it, therefore, you got your answer because I said so. That's Ipse dixit.
It's like, I'm going to Ipse dixit you until you can Ipse dixit for yourself. You can rely on my Ipse dixit until you get your own Ipse dixit.
I love it. Okay. So here's some Ipse dixit arguments from our buddies. Criticism. Something changed with the spelling here. I can't even see that's misspelled. I don't know what happened.
Huh? I don't know. I think it was public school is what happened.
You know what? I'm willing to bet. I think you just did this to.
I think UCLA is what happened. Where did you go to college, man?
UCLA Bruins with spell checkers.
Is
Okay.
it the BROONS, the Bruins?
You know what? I don't. You got me. All
Criticism.
right.
It's fine. It's fine. I'm not going to criticize your spelling anymore.
You are, but that's okay. I still like you. It's wrong to criticize leaders of the church, even if the criticism is true. I mean, where's the evidence? Where's the rationale for that, Dallin Oaks? I mean, seriously. Like you, Kolby, your bishop has been molesting kids for 10 years. He's caught molesting children as a bishop. He goes to prison, and you're not supposed to criticize? I mean, give me a break. Of course you can. Any adult knows that if you're caught or if you're, doing something wrong, you're subject to criticism. But here we're just supposed to magically wash it all away. What do you guys think?
I think once a bishop, always a bishop, except for this bishop in prison is going to be called the bitch up. He's going to be somebody's bitch up in prison.
That's true. Kolby, once again, can you top that one?
Nope.
Okay, I'm just going to stop here. Okay, but criticism, that's a great one. Now, how about doubt?
The silver fox, Dieter Uchtdorf, doubt your doubts. According to who? When you're in a court case and in the courtroom, one of the most important things to listen to are your opponent's criticisms and doubts of your work. Because I forget who said it, but listen, it was basically somebody who said, listen to your enemies because they will tell you, I forget if it was the truth.
The truth about you?
Yeah, something like that. So, of course, you want to listen to your doubts. When I go through our assignments, I'm hyper vigilant of looking for doubts and looking for weaknesses so that they can be addressed at some level, or we change our mind or whatever we need to do. Any thoughts from you guys on this one?
Yeah, I'll go first so I don't have to top RFM. A few years ago, and I think you and I have talked about how we kind of share from different lenses, but share this background a little bit, Randy. A few years ago, I was doing property tax valuation cases for our state. And we had a big challenge with a big taxpayer. We're talking about, multi-billion-dollar valuation questions. So I would have to in fact, I did hire an expert like Randy for that case. And we, I think actually you gave me the referral of who I contacted, Randy, now that I think back to it. One of the things that I was reminiscing with the client that I did this case for, because I work close to them again. And so we were having lunch, and he was like the head of the client, the division administrator. And as we were talking about starting this case, he reminded me that the way this case started was after I had gotten the other side's briefing, which kind of came as a surprise, their complaint and basically their position in the lawsuit. I spent all weekend exhaustively researching it, went into the office on Monday, and we had almost an all day kick the tires type meeting where I basically sat there with our in-house experts and asked them a series of questions and saying, why isn't this argument right? Why isn't this argument right? I was basically acting as the devil's advocate, using the other side's arguments to say, tell me why they're not right here. Tell me why they're not right here. Tell me why they're not right here. I was exercising those doubts. I was investigating those doubts. And this guy, I had completely forgotten about this interaction. He was telling me that after we had that meeting, all of his staff hated my guts for 2 days until they realized that I was doing that to vet the case. And then after I had answers to the questions, I fought like hell, tooth and nail, because I had investigated those doubts, had checked them out, exercised an amount of skepticism about our own position, didn't just uncritically accept it. They felt so much more supported down the road because of that approach. So this approach of doubt your doubts, all it is a good way to never change your mind. It's not a good way to actually be correct if that's what your objective is.
Well said. Yeah. If you want to get at the truth, you don't doubt your doubts.
No.
Sorry,
RFM. It's a catchy phrase, but it's moronic. And I say that with all respect to my Teutonic friend, Elder Dieter Uchtdorf. Your doubts are your doubts because they have failed so far in the competition of facts. Now, maybe more facts will change that, or maybe it'll cement it or modify it or something like that. But your doubts are your doubts because they are losing in the truth race. So the way to deal with them is not just to doubt them, because they're already doubts for a reason. You don't doubt them just for the sake of doubting them, because the thing that the truth race is losing is Mormonism. That's really what he's saying. So this is very quotable. It makes no sense. It's actually the reverse of what you should do. You should not doubt your doubts. You have doubts for a reason, and you should investigate and keep those doubts and cherish those doubts, because your doubts are just as important to you, if not more important than the truth.
Well, and to go hand in hand with the quote from Karl Popper, or I'm sorry, not from Karl Popper, from David Hume that we used at the close of the last time we talked about the Light and Truth letter, RFM. It was Hume who said, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. Having doubts is using that what I think is a profound truth from David Hume, it's taking that seriously. Your doubts are how you correctly apportion your beliefs to the evidence. It's knowing that there's areas where your worldview or your argument is on shaky ground. Every worldview or every argument has those points where you have to be aware that those are your harder points that you're kind of stretching on.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have a doubt, it's because you've concluded this thing is more likely than not true. So you don't make it true just by doubting your doubts. I think we probably hit this a number of times and maybe too much there. But going on to this one, a useful truth. What's this about, Randy?
Well, let me just make one more comment. All of these are thought-stopping cliches, including doubt your doubts. That's all it's designed to do, is to keep you from thinking. Useful truth. Dallin Oaks is famous for saying that not everything that's true is useful. In what world does he live? I mean, truth may be unpleasant. It may make you upset. It may challenge your very core, but all truth is useful. And for a singular one true church leader, presumably the next leader of the Mormon church, to say that the truth is not always useful, I can't say any more about it until, without just going, using very foul language. So I'll quickly resort to your guys' comments.
So Elder Packer, I think, initiated this, as far as I know, but Dallin Oaks did make the same comment just a few years later in the same audience. He was presenting to the same CES audience as Elder Packer had been. So yeah, he does say the same thing. And what they're doing here is they're taking something that is actually a truism. We all understand that not everything that's true is useful. For instance, if I were to say how many hairs are on Randy's head, well, I don't know right now. But if you counted them all, that would be a truth that would probably not be useful for a whole lot. We all understand that. But church leaders use this in order to hide truths that are important in coming to our conclusions about whether the church is true. So that's what I see him doing there, and Elder Packer before him. In other words, things that are true that will lead you away from the church are not useful. Mm-hmm. That's really what it means.
Yeah, and to Randy's point that these are often thought-stopping cliches, I've shared this term before, which I think was coined by Dan Dennett, this idea of deepities, which are phrases that sound profound, but they're, to the extent they're true, they're trivial, and to the extent they sound profound, they're false. Mm-hmm. And I think both doubt your doubts and not everything that's true or useful are good examples of that. They're almost like nonsensical phrases when you actually start to think about what they mean. And your example is a great one, RFM, on why this one is so nonsensical.
I think they are talismanic boogeymen meant to drive the doubts back into the closet. You just say these enough times and you don't have to deal with the issues.
Yeah, and Dallin Oaks knows a thing or two about the inside of closets.
Well, and I would just like to add, notice that each one of these little Mormon truisms, there's no evidence to back it up. There's no discussion of why that makes sense. It's simply laid out, it's dropped on you with no backup whatsoever. And there's no way to back it up because with any kind of critical thinking, which is what we're talking about, they fall apart as arguments.
But it's okay because you have to accept it on his Ipse dixit that it's true.
Exactly. He says it, and therefore it's true because he's an authority and you're not. And that's another thing about Mormonism. A lot of the truth of Mormonism is dependent on who says it rather than what's said. The homeless guy on the street may say something, and just because he's homeless, it doesn't mean anything in and of itself. You have to look at the argument and challenge the argument or accept the argument based upon the merits of the argument. All right, next one. Now this one really cracks me up. This is our buddy Dallin Oaks again. I suggest that research is not the answer. And let me say this as the CEO of Landmark Research Group, which has been involved in some significant cases for decades, that research is the answer. I can't think, this is from my perspective, because that's what we do every day is research, of a more profoundly ignorant statement than this, that research is not the answer? Since when I was a kid, Mormonism was all about exploring everything that you could from whatever source you could to build a body of knowledge of solid truth. And now you got these guys so turned upside down, so desperate and so insecure that you have the presumed next leader of the Mormon church saying, I suggest that research is not the answer. That's absurd.
And as a former justice with the Utah Supreme Court, how many times do you think he told that to his clerks? Hey guys, when you're doing this briefing for me, you might want to knock off on the research because I really don't think that's the answer. That's not going to get you to the truth.
Yeah.
By the way, Randy, you see the picture over there of Dallin Oaks?
Yeah.
I think that whoever made that misspelled his last name.
It wasn't me. It was the TV station.
I know, and I'm doing this sort of, to help you out.
Take the heat off me. Thanks. I appreciate it.
RFM, don't you know it is wrong to criticize Randy's spelling, even if the spelling is incorrect?
It is wrong, but that's why I wanted to give him the old fig leaf there by showing him that somebody else did it too. So it doesn't make your spelling right, but it means you're not alone.
Okay, well, there's a new fallacy I think we've come up with. This is a spelling fallacy to say that bad spelling is a point against the argument. Let's stick with the argument. All right, so
that every
now
bad
the next
speller
one,
ever.
Our buddy Boyd K. Packer. I was really sad when he died because he was such a gift in terms of saying things that would just shock anybody with 2 brain cells north of a rock. Here he says, some things that are true are not very useful. I mean, again, you see this parade of so-called leaders that are of the singular one true church, downplaying the importance of truth. What's going on here? What do you guys think?
I think this is a picture of the true happiness that only Mormonism can bring.
Oh, that was a good one.
Yeah.
Your turn,
Kolby,
Kolby.
what do you say?
Well, no, I think this goes hand in hand with what RFM said. Now, are there areas where I can understand in the abstract that there are times that the truth may lead to undesirable consequences? The classic example, of course, right, is you're keeping Jews in the attic and we're during the Holocaust and dealing with the Nazis. That's the classic example that people come up with to illustrate the tension between like situational ethics and like strict Kantian deontology. I always have to follow this objective rule in every single circumstance. This is where what he's saying is correct in the abstract, like RFM said with his example of the number of hairs on Randy's head. It's true that truth may not be that useful, but the way he's applying it and what he was talking about, when I think in the context of his church, he's talking about, or in the context of his talk where he gave this statement, he's talking about understanding church history. And I think that Dallin Oaks was using this, or he was on the same topic.
Yep.
That's where it becomes very problematic, and where I again suggest it's kind of like a deepity. To the extent that it's true, it's completely trivial, and to the extent where it's being applied, it's absolutely disastrous epistemology.
Very good. Oh, here we get to the next one.
So that kind of wraps up our discussion of those kind of fallacies. Again, the common denominator being that they make these statements and don't back them up. And they're quite clear to don't question that. That defies all critical thinking. There are profound examples of logical fallacies there that are hard to one up. All right, so we're going to move on to my last one, onus probandi.
Well,
I think you misspelled that. It should be an A, shouldn't it? A-N-U-S probandi.
I'm glad you said that because that's an example of where your spelling is wrong and not mine.
Oh, no. I think my spelling is just alternate.
Well, like Thomas Jefferson said, if you can't think of more than one way to spell a word, you lack imagination. So moving on. Again, the definition is missing here, but onus probandi is basically saying, the black part is the definition, and it's basically saying that whoever makes the claim has the duty to back it up. In other words, when you go into the courtroom, we all go to the courtroom, we all know the plaintiff brought the claim. The defense just is defending against the claim. And so it is the duty, depending on the burden of proof, which we're about to talk about, to bring the evidence, whether in civil court, where it's the preponderance of evidence being 51% or better, or a criminal claim beyond a reasonable doubt. You have to bring evidence to prove your claim. It is not the duty of the defense to show what really happened or present a counterclaim that's compelling. Now, sometimes they do in the court, but I've been in the court where, basically the strategy is just to tear apart the claim and our job is done. And in other cases, we not only tear apart the argument, but we also present a counterclaim that sets things straight. But there's no duty to do that, by the way, because of this term onus probandi. Anything as attorneys you guys want to add about onus probandi?
I just want to mention that this actually, we can make sense out of this strange expression. Onus is a word that means burden, and it has made its way into the English language. We talk about having an onus. So that is something, a burden. And probandi comes from the same word as we get probative. So probative evidence means it has the ability to, I don't know, it's material, all right? It's material, it's relevant. These are all kind of synonyms, right? But it's probative to one side or the other, and it has to be in order for evidence to be admissible. It has to have something to do with the case, right? So onus probandi means the burden of proof. And as Randy has said, it's extended here in logical fallacy land to mean one side has the burden of proof. The side making the claim, the side who is the plaintiff, and the defense can win a case, and often does, without producing any evidence of its own. There is no burden on the defense to produce any evidence. They can if they choose to, but if they don't want to, they don't have to, and they can just say and argue that the plaintiff did not meet their burden of evidence.
And I was even going to suggest, for my days as a prosecutor, RFM, and your days as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, in closing arguments or even in the offering of the state's case, if the state attempts to impermissibly look like it's shifting the burden of proof onto a defendant and basically saying the defendant has some duty to prove himself, even in the rhetoric in a closing argument, that the defendant has some duty to prove himself innocent.
Why didn't they call this witness?
Right. That can amount to prosecutorial misconduct. And it's precisely, our legal system has developed that rule precisely because of how fallacious this idea is and how appealing it can be. Remember, that's one of the things I think it's important to keep in mind as we talk about all of these fallacies, is they're deceptively bad arguments. They're arguments that sound true until you actually stop and think about it for just a moment. That's why they're used so prevalently.
Right. And one of the classics here, and I hope I don't anticipate one of yours, but one of the classics is, okay, well, you have to prove to me how it was that Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon. Tell me how he did that naturalistically without God's help. Otherwise, I'm justified in content. Otherwise, I win the argument. Right? That's a complete shifting of the burden.
Put that on the back burner, because we're about to talk about Brian Hales with that exact argument.
Okay, here we go to the next slide.
Okay, so here's a slide. It's an exhibit we use when we're teaching the topic of critical thinking, but it's a pyramid, and I think it's the preponderance is the green. The preponderance evidence is what you see in civil court. What I just said about 51% or better. That's what you see when you're arguing about dollars and cents. I mean, the courts don't award hugs or apologies; they award dollars, and that's why computing the amount of those dollars is really kind of the conclusion in civil court. Criminal court, you're dealing with people's lives in prison, lives, incarcerated. It has a higher burden of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. In other words, no reasonable person would think you were innocent when your fingerprints are at the scene, the DNA matches things. It's all abductive reasoning where the clues add up to nobody possibly could have committed this crime except for the guy sitting in the chair over there. It's a higher burden of proof. What's interesting about Mormonism, and I wanted to bring this in, is Mormonism doesn't even have beyond a reasonable doubt. It is absolute truth. I know that it is true with no doubt, with every fiber of my being. Pick the adjectives, pick the phrases, but it excludes any other possibility whatsoever. That is a burden of proof that is so exponentially above anything else. Frankly, it's unrealistic. It's really not on this chart because it's frankly, it's irrational. We can't be that certain about things. But I just wanted to kind of bring into this conversation about the level of burden of proof, and the burden of proof. What is the burden of proof? Well, we've just talked about it, but it lies with the person bringing in the claim. What do you guys think?
Did you say that going to court is not about hugs? Because I think I may have been doing it wrong, Randy.
I hugged somebody in court once.
They gave you a hug?
Who was it?
Oh, it was a defense attorney. We were making up.
Well, was that in the verdict?
No.
Okay, well, there you go. So yeah, in terms of verdicts, it's in civil court, it's dollars. Anyway, so if there aren't any other comments, we'll move to the next slide.
I like that you're bringing up the different levels of confidence. This goes very well with that idea we just shared from Hume, that depending on the evidence, you're going to have these different confidence levels of how certain you are. And that clear and convincing evidence standard. So preponderance of the evidence standard, Randy, you're right, is most civil matters. But civil matters that have more particular proof levels, so say something like fraud is typically one that requires proof at the clear and convincing evidence standard. It's basically something that's between the criminal standard, beyond a reasonable doubt, and the normal civil standard. And cases, when you're litigating cases that involve a heightened evidentiary standard, you absolutely think about those things and you treat those cases differently than you would a preponderance evidence standard. And so this just helps show that how confident you are has to be based on the evidence, the actual evidence you have available to you, a la David Hume.
And the classic example of that is O.J. Simpson, R.I.P., which is that he was acquitted at criminal trial where the burden of proof was greater beyond a reasonable doubt, but he was found to have committed the murder of his wife in a civil trial afterward by a preponderance of the evidence. So basically, I didn't follow the second trial, but the evidence was basically the same. It's just the burden of proof was lower. So he was found to have committed murder civilly. Also, the other funny thing about it, I think it's funny, is that he could not testify. He could not refuse to testify, as he did in the criminal case, because he has the right to not testify. In the civil case, he has no such right to not testify, and he was called as a witness, I think, by the plaintiff.
Yeah, it's a quintessential example of that. I did follow that because the O.J. Simpson case was one of my cases. The Brown family lives close to Benny Hinn, but yeah, we were all following that very, very closely. But getting into the original trial, I guess I don't want to go down that tangent, but the defense was very, very good, if you want to use that term, in creating doubt to bring it up to that beyond reasonable doubt standard. But anyway, I think I know who did it, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Did he write a book about it?
Did he ever find the real murderer?
I said, did he write a book about it?
Who, OJ?
The real murderer. Did the real murderer write a book about it?
He actually did. It's called If I Did It, I think. OJ wrote a book and basically explained how he did it, but he put the word if very small letters on the book. Anyway, that's another episode. So, Otis Probandi, could you read? This is Joseph Smith, chapter 1, verse actually 18 and 19. And can you, well, I can read it, actually. Joseph Smith is purportedly having his first vision. This is the 1838 account, not the 1830 account where God the Father, the creator of the universe, didn't show up. This is the one where both God the Father and Jesus showed up. And Joseph Smith says, I was answered that I must join none of them, meaning the churches that he was exploring, for they were all wrong. Now, notice the word all. That's an absolute. And the personage who addressed me said that all their creeds were an abomination. All. Again, another absolute. And in this site, the professors, and in his site, that the professors were all corrupt. All again, three alls, three absolutes. So in other words, Joseph Smith is being told that the entire world, without exception, all, three times are all wrong, all corrupt, all an abomination. And they draw near unto me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Okay, this is Joseph Smith's claim. This is a fundamental claim of Mormonism that Mormons today hate to be reminded of. But this is Mormon God basically saying that everybody else is wrong without exception. And this is particularly embarrassing when the general authorities meet with the, I think it was the Tibetan or the Buddhist leaders a few weeks ago, or meet with the Pope, because according to Joseph Smith and the foundational claim of the church, they're all wrong, and they have to back that up. And not only do they not want to back up that claim, they want to bury that claim as much as they possibly can. At least that's my opinion. What do you guys think?
Kolby?
Well, the first thing I'd point out is, as you highlighted, this is from Joseph Smith's 1838 account. In Joseph Smith's 1832 account, which RFM and I have talked about, so I just want to note it, that Joseph Smith comes to these conclusions himself. He makes a point of saying in his 1832 account that his study of the scriptures is what led him to these conclusions. And then in 1838, that those conclusions that Joseph Smith formed through his study of the scriptures get put into the mouth of God, which I think is a very important thing that people need to keep in mind. It doesn't have to deal with the fallacy that you're talking about here, but my experience is the same as yours, Randy. When Mormonism tries to do, or when apologists try and do ecumenical things, this is the thing that I always come back to, is this was the original claim. This is the result of the great apostasy, which, similar to RFM when he was talking about evolution and the fall and the need for the fall, if you don't have an apostasy, you have absolutely no need for a restoration. So as the church quietly walks back some of these things, that's the problem, is that the proposition doesn't make any sense anymore, because they keep walking away from this idea, including scholarship coming from BYU, that there even was a great apostasy.
Yeah, and after having established that all the other religions are completely wrong, abomination, and corrupt, now, almost 200 years later, the LDS Church is doing everything they can to look exactly like them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it also would beg the question, not beg the question in the fallacy sense, it would prompt the question to me, if everyone on earth was wrong about religion before Joseph Smith, why is Joseph Smith borrowing, or at least seemingly borrowing, so many of his ideas from Adam Clarke? That's another question that I think they really haven't grappled with. How can Joseph Smith believe that everything in Christianity is so corrupt and take so many things from Adam Clarke?
Yeah. And to say all creeds are an abomination, one thing I don't think I ever learned in the Mormon church is this thing called the Jesus Creed, which is simply reciting the basic command, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Nothing controversial about that whatsoever. And yet, according to Mormon God, that creed is an abomination. The Jesus Creed is an abomination. It is so ridiculous at so many levels.
God didn't know about the Jesus Creed. He wasn't including the Jesus Creed. God only knows so many creeds.
Yeah.
And one of them named Apollo.
That's the RFM apologist coming through again.
Absolutely. I'm here to represent the apologists. I am the Lorax. I speak for the Mormons.
All right. Well, now we get to talk about our favorite buddy, Brian Hales.
This is a great picture of him because it's like the strings have actually been brushed out. You can't even see them.
Well, I got it from his website. Kolby, do you mind reading this, please?
No, I would not. Brian Hales, a Latter-day Saint scholar and author, challenges critics of Joseph Smith's authorship of the Book of Mormon by arguing that they need to propose a plausible, naturalistic explanation for its creation. I've actually had this discussion with Brian Hales on Facebook, and it usually amounts to him saying, but where did the words come from? Like that's some hard to answer question.
Yeah.
I know. And, you know, children have been known to stop him on the street because they actually think he's a marionette.
Well, all true. I will just add that there's a few problems here with Brian Hales. One is we're talking about onus probandi, and what he does here is he tries to flip the burden of proof from the church making the claim that the Book of Mormon is true and a historical document, and flipping the burden to us as critics or non-members or any one of the 99.998% of the world's population that isn't Mormon. Somehow it's on us to prove that it's not true. That is a classic example of the burden of proof being misunderstood and frankly abused and manipulated to flip things around, when Brian Hales and his ilk have the responsibility of proving it is true. They are obviously failing so miserably that the church is losing and hemorrhaging millions of members. So they try, their next tactic is to make us responsible for their claim. What do you guys think?
I think you're right. I like your use of the word ilk. Brian Hales and his marionette ilk.
Yes. Kolby?
Yeah, well, and when we transition, one of my logical fallacies we're going to talk about is special pleading. And I think it's important to highlight, like, depending on the exact argument, there's lots of similarities amongst these different ways of fallaciously thinking. And one of the reasons that this is such a flawed way of thinking is because if that's the rule, if I can make a claim and then Brian Hales just has to disprove it, it's like they don't even think about the fact that if that's the rules of engagement, then I'll just do the same thing back to you. I'll just make a claim and now you have to disprove it. I claim that the Book of Mormon is not true. Now prove to me that it, like, that's why the person who's making the affirmative claim, the first affirmative claim, bears the burden of proof, because that's the only way it will work. Otherwise, it just goes back and forth forever, like grade school antics. I'm rubber, you're glue, you know, like that type of game.
Yeah, you're another one.
Yeah.
By the way, little known fact, Brian Hale's favorite song is I Got No Strings. All right, number 8 is called...
Wait, go back. We're not quite done there.
We're not done?
I want to say about our buddy Brian. And that is, and this goes into stuff that RFM and I are putting together, but while I stand by my position, the position that the person making the claim has the burden of proof, that hasn't prevented in the courtroom anybody from presenting counterclaims along with their defense. And it doesn't prevent critics of the church from explaining how the Mormon or the Book of Mormon came to be. And on that point, you know, RFM and I have seen a few magic shows together, and I don't want to get into that at this time, but I will say that
I don't want to get into how I wasn't invited, but that.
Oh, well,
we talked about you some.
You're always invited, but the point is,
it was mostly about how we're so glad that Kolby wasn't there.
I wanted you to be there, and RFM had his way. What can I say? So my point is that I'm trying desperately to get to is
it's not the first time I've had my way with Randy.
Oh my gosh. After the, let's take the Penn and Teller show. We left the show, and of course, you know, I had taken mental notes of every trick they had done and how, you know, my explanation for how they did them. And then RFM would say, yeah, but they could have done that. And they could have done that. And anyways, on any particular trick, we came up with 2, 3, maybe 4 plausible ways they could have done that trick. In other words, you know, how did Joseph Smith write the Book of Mormon or dictate it? You know, the short answer is I don't know. But I know that there are multiple plausible explanations that make a lot of sense when you look at automatic writing, you look at the plagiarism, and on and on. There are numerous explanations. Now, which one of those explanations or any combination thereof are not the way he did it, we'll never know because that's lost to history. But my point is, Brian Hales, you and your folks and your ilk have the responsibility to back up your claim, but that doesn't prevent us from coming up with numerous explanations for how it was done. So going back to Jeffrey Holland, how you got to go over it or under it or through it. Well, that's all been done. There are numerous explanations for how it's been done.
Yeah, and it's not the thing I highlighted with Brian is if Brian's going to use that test, then by his own standard, he needs to explain how Muhammad dictated the Quran, but he's unable to do that. This is what highlights how fallacious the thinking is and why he's engaged in special pleading on the standard he applies. He only makes this exception for Mormonism.
Yeah, beautiful point. In fact, I think that supplanted anything that RFM could possibly say, so we can move on.
He's muted anyways. It's fantastic.
And RFM's on mute.
We're going to have to leave Brian Hales on Pleasure Island while we continue with
All
our
right.
logical fallacies. Next one up is called special pleading. It's number 8.
Number 8, special pleading. This is one of mine. So this is where you make exceptions to rules or standards without justification. And I'm seeing a clear link between Brian Hales and this one. Here's my example, kind of sarcastic. So if a dusty diary snippet hints that Joseph Smith was a prophet, that is rock solid history. Absolutely. But the minute a diary mentions treasure digging, suddenly we don't have enough context. The idea here being that the church demands evidence and logic until its own claims are questioned, right? What I just said about Brian Hales and the Quran is what I'm talking about. He makes a special exception for the Book of Mormon that he doesn't make for any other book. Very
good.
Beautiful.
So my first example of special pleading is I did an episode with Bill and RFM. I think it was I actually don't know how long ago it was, but we did an episode on Mormonism Live called Jacob Hansen's Thinking Errors. I didn't actually pull a clip. I just wanted to talk about the episode and point people to it. In this episode, Jacob Hansen debated one of the polygamy deniers named Jacob Isbell after they had wrestled and Jacob Hansen got his ass kicked. And what we highlighted in this debate is because he's debating a polygamy denier, he's using historical evidence and the historical method to disprove the polygamy denier's contentions. But he doesn't use that same standard when we're talking about establishing archaeological evidence for the Book of Mormon, genetic evidence for the Book of Mormon, like any type of evidence for the idea that the priesthood exists as an actual thing that can work in the world. And so this is a classic example. And in fact, there were, I think, 4 different times throughout the transcript as I was looking over it that we used examples of special pleading. The examples were just a little too long to share. So people can go to that episode and basically check it out, an entire episode dedicated to Jacob Hansen engaging in special pleading.
Very good. That's on Mormon Discussions website. It is a Mormonism Live show, I think, from a few months ago.
Mm-hmm. Another example of special pleading, again, where we create a special category to maintain our belief in something, is the way that believers use the testimony of the 3 witnesses. So I'm just highlighting here David Whitmer. So in David Whitmer's An Address to All Believers in Christ, many of us grew up, if you grew up in the church or you were a convert like RFM, you would have heard that David Whitmer, even though he left the church, did not ever contradict his testimony of the Book of Mormon. And that comes from, the citation where that comes from is this pamphlet that David Whitmer published called An Address to All Believers in Christ. And I think I have the 1887 publication date on there. But what believers never want to talk about is the fact that David Whitmer in the same pamphlet or in the same small book talks about how Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. I'll go ahead and read. Most people are going to be familiar with the fact that he said that he never denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon, and I think it's etched on his gravestone. So I'll just read the second quote that believers never want to talk about, which is where David Whitmer says, because he was starting his own church, "We do not endorse the teachings of any of the so-called Mormons or Latter-day Saints, which are in conflict with the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ as taught in the New Testament and the Book of Mormon. They have departed in a great measure from the faith of the Church of Christ as it was first established by heeding revelations given through Joseph Smith, who, after being called of God to translate his sacred word, the Book of Mormon, drifted into many errors and gave many revelations to introduce doctrines, ordinances, and offices in the church which are in conflict with Christ's teachings. And we could finish reading the rest of that where he gives more specific examples, including polygamy. My point being, though, if believers are going to take David Whitmer's testimony as valid evidence, that should cut both ways. You need to consider the fact that David Whitmer was willing to testify of the Book of Mormon as well as to testify against Joseph Smith, but you rarely hear that second one. What do you guys think about this example?
Well, I'm willing to accept his testimony on the Book of Mormon, but I thoroughly reject his testimony as to Joseph Smith.
Is this the guy that talked to the deer?
That was Martin Harris.
I get them all mixed up. I think you nailed it.
Okay, let's try the next one.
Perfect. So this
Who's
is
a picture of now?
You said that we were going to give him a break, and I kind of felt bad. I felt like I needed to say something. This is our friend Austin Fife with some lines from his Light on Truth letter.
Those must not be critics around him because he doesn't really talk to the critics.
Well, that's true. He does not talk to the critics, but he is just a dude who wrote a letter after all. He is engaged constantly in special pleading. So this is from the linguistic chapter, which you and I have covered together, RFM,
which we dismantled, which we rendered limb from freaking limb. Yes, I remember.
We did. I think that's one of the best ones in the series we've done so far. This is where Austin talks about the Book of Mormon and linguistic evidence, and he says, the further along my faith journey I traveled, the less comfortable I was with critical explanations for the Book of Mormon. I marveled at the critics' conspiracy theory-like reconstruction of how Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon. When I mentally recreated the critics' narrative, I felt like I was left with a scenario more unbelievable than an angel simply giving gold plates to Joseph. And I just wanted to highlight the special pleading here is the fact that he's demanding, similar to Randy's example with Brian Hales, he's demanding that critics explain where every word of the Book of Mormon came from naturalistically, when the believers aren't even able to do that same thing from their side, right? Except for the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God. That's the only thing you'll hear. But when it comes to tight versus loose translation, they're really unable to offer their own cohesive single theory from where the Book of Mormon came from. So to demand that of critics is just ridiculous.
How much Joseph Smith contributed versus how much God contributed, how the King James Bible ends up in there. They have got many, many, many levels of different explanations that are not agreed upon by the critics. And yet he's insisting that, by the Mormons, by the believing Mormons. But he's insisting that the critics come to him with only one theory, which of course we can't at this point because multiple have been proposed by this point. And that's evidence against them. And then he will misrepresent the believing Mormon position as very simple. It's just an angel gave the plates to Joseph.
Right. Exactly. I also just really like, and I'm going to read it one more time. This is one of the dumbest sentences I've ever heard. When I mentally recreated the critic's narrative, I felt like I was left with a scenario more unbelievable than an angel simply giving gold plates to Joseph. Any naturalistic theory of where the Book of Mormon came from, even Spalding-Rigdon manuscript theory, which I don't believe because I don't think the evidence is there, that is more likely than an angel giving golden plates to Joseph. And the only reason you would think it isn't is if you really don't understand the basics of critical thinking.
And it's not even close. It's not like it's a close thing. It is astronomically more likely. Any naturalistic explanation, no matter how unbelievable, is more likely than a supernatural explanation. Do you agree with that, Randy? I know you're a token Christian here.
Yeah, I partially agree with you. The problem with that is when I was going through my thing, I started reading a lot of science, Scientific American, and in there is a guy by the name of John Horgan. He wrote a book called The End of Science. You know, he's a scientist, but he introduced me through his book, and I did have a little correspondence with him, but to quantum physics. And quantum physics, again, is a very big topic, but quantum physics, by definition, cannot be explained with empirical science. It can't be explained with classical physics or traditional physics. And so ironically, science is what kind of opened up my mind to allowing supernatural, in exploring the supernatural, I guess that's the best way of saying it. There's one more thing I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was. But that basically, I have left the door open on the supernatural, ironically, because of science.
I don't know a lot about it, but is this a situation where we're looking, by we, I mean scientists and smart people, that they're looking for a new version of physics in order to deal with these new things they're finding out in quantum physics?
Well, on this Bart Ehrman trip, ironically, one of the other people traveling with us in the group was a professor in quantum physics. And so I picked his brain. I'm sure the guy was glad the trip to be over, because I really did ask him a lot of questions about quantum physics. Quantum physics is stuff like quantum tunneling, where it's solid through solid. It can't be explained with classical physics. It's the split light experiment, where the results of the test are dependent upon human consciousness being part of the experiment or not. How do you explain human consciousness affecting how light travels? And yet that's what they're finding in quantum physics. There's quantum entanglement, where particles are split, the electrons are split and put hundreds of miles away, and when you reverse polarity on one, the other one instantly does the same thing. Can't be explained with classic things. So in other words, these experiments in quantum physics are indistinguishable from the supernatural. By definition, supernatural means things that cannot be explained naturally. And classic physics, that's what it does, and they can't be explained with classic physics.
Do you foresee a time when we will be able to explain it with physics, new physics?
That kind of goes to God of the gap arguments. And, in the courtroom, and you guys know this, you make your decisions based upon the evidence in hand, and what's going to happen in the future is speculation. The short answer is I don't know, but they seem, based upon the evidence in hand, to be pretty, they've really stumped people. It is what it is.
Yeah, now that the quantum physics cat is out of the box, and yes, I said box, not bag. People who get it will get it.
Yeah.
I think when we're talking here specifically about a historical question, which is how a book was dictated. So taking everything you said, Randy, I think I'm looking here specifically at what Austin's writing, which is he's trying to deal with where a book may have come from. And I think I'm not trying to oversell it with maybe going to everything can be explained naturalistically, because you're right. The more I listen to folks like Sean Carroll or some of the people who talk about quantum physics, it is almost like Arthur C. Clarke said, right? Indistinguishable from magic, or it feels indistinguishable from magic.
Yeah.
The difference is between that and maybe like Joseph Smith's claims to have received golden plates from an angel, is that there is actual evidence for the theory of quantum mechanics and how it operates. As you talked about, there's experimentation like the double slit experiment, and even the thought experiment of Schrodinger's cat, that help explain where the theory is coming from. It's not just because I said so, right? I think that's one of the differences I think that you'd agree with, right? That's one of the differences here.
I kind of agree, but that's one of the questions I posed to this quantum physics professor, and he says, when I really kind of drilled down to it, and I'm a scientist, but I'm a social scientist. I'm not an economist. I'm not a I've got a C in physics, let's be honest. So with my 3-pound brain trying to enter his world a little bit, I asked him questions along those lines, and he basically said, we got the math, but we don't have in other words, we have the theory, but we don't have it showing up as being able to explain it other than through math. It's kind of like gravity. We have the math to show what gravity does, but not how. I don't know how well I'm explaining that. So there's still quite a gap there. And
I think that's a good point. And I think one of the things I'd say maybe to cap this conversation, because I had it earlier and then I didn't mention it for some reason, is I don't know is an acceptable answer, right?
Oh, yeah.
So when I say evidence, I mean they do the double slit experiment where an electron seems like it's acting like a wave, and then it seems like it's acting like a particle, depending on where it's at in that experiment.
Yeah.
We don't know why. We don't know why. We don't know why gravity has the attractive effect that it does. So I think, but I think where the fallacy comes in is being uncomfortable or unable to admit that I don't know is a valid answer to a question. And I think you highlighted it when you were talking about the Book of Mormon and saying, how did Joseph Smith dictate the Book of Mormon? I don't know. You don't know. RFM doesn't know. Do we have multiple theories that may explain where pieces and parts of it came from, or maybe the entirety of it? I think we do. And I think that's kind of the connection I'm seeing here.
Yeah.
Can I tell you the single great? Oh, I'm sorry, Brandy. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's very well stated.
I just want to say the single greatest evidence that Joseph Smith could produce the Book of Mormon. Are you ready for it? It's the freaking Book of Mormon. Apologists want to act like there's no Book of Mormon in the equation, okay? How could Joseph Smith could not have produced the Book of Mormon? He just wasn't educated enough, this, that, the other thing. You have to prove it. And I'll say, well, if you take the Book of Mormon off the table as evidence, then maybe you've got a point. But the problem is that the Book of Mormon proves that Joseph Smith could produce the Book of Mormon. It's the single most important piece of evidence. And if you don't think Joseph Smith produced it, fine. It shows that somebody else could produce the Book of Mormon, because as Dan Vogel said once memorably, he says about the Book of Mormon, he says, well, do you think Joseph Smith could have written it? And he just goes, well, somebody wrote it. I thought that was a great comment.
Yeah, that's good.
All right. So let's not take the most important piece of evidence off the table like the apologist would like you to. Yeah, other than the Book of Mormon, where's the evidence that Joseph Smith could have written it? Now, this looks like some messages that you were involved in, Kolby, under your nom de guerre of strong attorney.
Yep. So this is another example of special pleading, and it was relevant. This is from a Reddit thread that was discussing the information that was leaked, basically about the church through an intermediary soliciting social media influencers to basically advertise for the church without disclosing that they were advertisements for the church. Oh,
right. The late breaking story.
Yeah, just yesterday. And so this believer that I was commenting back and forth with, I just thought this was a perfect example of special pleading in action. This person said, they were asked like what they thought about it. And they said, I think it is essential. I am a bishop and I refuse to do a post about the church. I may do a post about Jesus during Easter or something, but that's it.
So you're saying you think it's essential. This guy is saying he's a bishop and he thinks it's essential that the church pay influencers to say positive messages about the church.
Correct. And he drives that home with his second paragraph where he says, most of what is online is negative towards the church. So they really have no choice to do this to get more positive out there. I think he's saying, but to do this to get more positive.
That sounds like a false dichotomy to me.
Yeah, it's because fallacious thinking often comes in many different flavors. So when you're looking at one logical fallacy, you'll often find several others, just depending on how you explain it. So
they congregate in groups.
Exactly. We need to come up with a term for it, like murder of crows, a gaggle of logical fallacies. I'm not sure. We'll come up with something better than that. So I commented back to this person because I just thought the way he drove it home, claiming to be a believer, claiming to be a bishop, and saying the church has no choice but to do this. I just think that was so funny. So I commented back to him and said, wait, don't they supposedly represent and counsel with the omnipotent God? When junior apologists make excuses like this, you kind of give away the game that there's no divinity behind any of this. It is just an organization like every other organization out there, only worse because it seems to think it's above the law and the other requirements. RFM, would you read his response to me?
I am going to, and I'll try and do it in an appropriately snooty tone. Number one, I work in marketing, so I view this as a marketer, not as your description of junior apologist. And number two, I view the church as a business org and being run by a CEO, Nelson. I see God as someone on the board of directors God is someone on the board of directors, but Nelson is the CEO. Okay, so God is someone, he's just some schmo on the board of directors who steps in rarely I know this isn't what the church teaches, but it's what I believe. So God kind of just does his old proxy vote in the board meetings.
Yeah. As a Christian, Randy, how do you feel about God being relegated to an absentee member on the board of directors?
Well, it's absurd whether you're Christian or not. God is God, but Mormons sometimes forget that.
It was his family business. He's really just there because his name's on the side of the building.
Yeah.
So I respond back to this person and I say, when I say junior apologist, I just mean people who feel the need to defend the church instinctively like you did. Most often these defenses are, like yours, clearly fallacious, which you yourself seem to recognize. I know this isn't what the church teaches, but it's what I believe. I'm not describing some professional title. By admitting you are approaching it as a marketeer, you are just proving my point that there is no divinity behind any of this. It is just an organization like every single other organization out there. And here's
So
where
that's what talking about junior apologists, like Junior Birdman.
Yeah. I've decided that the term junior apologist is better than what I really want to say, which is dipshit. Number two is where I really drive the special pleading point home, which is where I say, I would be willing to bet you only take this view when it's necessary to respond to criticisms like this. This is in response to him saying, I see the church like any other business organization. I'm looking at this like a marketer. And I said, I doubt that you would let any other business organization dictate as much of your life's decisions, making you pay it 10% of your income for the rest of your life, dictate your underwear, dictate who you marry, where you're going to marry. And then I said, would I be correct? And my point is just, you see this special pleading, and it actually is a form of Motte and Bailey as well, RFM, to go back to your Motte and Bailey example, where when they're pushed on something, they want to defend the church by using the same rules that would apply to any other organization. But we know damn well they don't they don't govern their behavior towards the church like they would according to that standard, except where it's convenient. And that's why it's a form of special pleading.
Yeah, I think of special pleading as making excuses for somebody that you wouldn't make for anybody else.
Exactly.
And usually that somebody, if you're a Mormon, is Mormons and Mormon church leaders. You make excuses for Joseph Smith. You wouldn't make for anybody else. You make excuses for the Book of Mormon. You wouldn't make for any other book of scripture.
Exactly.
Yeah, one of my funnest, when I really am in that mood where I want to get things going, I post on Facebook and some of the pages I'm in that how is Joseph Smith any different than Warren Jeffs or David Koresh or, pick any one of these perverts. And the responses are crazy. They're literally saying, well, Joseph Smith was a prophet and these other guys weren't. It's like, okay, talk about behavior being indistinguishable one amongst the other. How is this any different? And that's their best answer.
That is special pleading taken to its absolute most absurd conclusion.
Yeah. If you want to piss Mormons off, that's how you do it.
Here's a good example of another form of special pleading, or this idea of, to me, special pleading is also, Mormons engage in it constantly when they do this game of selective skepticism, where they pretend like we can't know things that we obviously do know by any reasonable standard, almost going back to Randy's slide where he broke down the different standards of proof. And I wanted to highlight this. You and Bill talked about this new essay that the church has put out on the origins of the Book of Abraham, RFM. This is separate from the original Gospel Topics essay, but I wanted to draw attention to this line in particular. The church says the relationship between the Egyptian writings on those papyri, the papyri that are preserved today, that we have the scraps of, and the scriptural text, meaning the scriptural text of the Book of Abraham that we have today, is not known. That is bullshit. That we know the relationship between those two things to any reasonable standard, and it's special pleading on the church's part and on these apologists' parts to act like it's not the case. And I'll demonstrate that in just a few short little slides here.
Right. And you might also think that if you don't know the relationship between the papyri and the Book of Abraham that Joseph Smith said he translated them from the papyri, then that might be a problem.
Yes. Yeah, it's a huge problem.
And they've tried, believe me, they've tried to figure out the relationship, but they have not been able to because there is none.
Well, they would sure wish there to be none. That's the problem, is that there actually is.
So what it is we know what it was that Joseph Smith was translating, and we know he was translating at least portions of the Book of Abraham from portions of the papyrus that we have. That is undisputable. And we won't go on that sidetrack now, but we know that. And I think that's what you're talking about. What I'm talking about is what's actually written on the papyrus versus what's actually written in the book of Abraham, and there's no relationship.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Yes, absolutely.
So you have something else here that's underlined?
I think I actually highlighted that for a different reason. We might hit that when we get to equivocation.
Okay, so you want me to go on?
Yep, thank you. So this comes from Gerald Tanner. On the left-hand side, you can see photos from one of the scraps of papyrus that were preserved after the Chicago fire and that were found and then given back to the church by the museum that located the papyrus scraps and
I think these might
recognized
have
what
been in
they were.
Missouri at the time the blaze was going, but yeah.
Yeah. And on the right-hand side, you can see a document known as the Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language, part of which is written in Joseph Smith's hand, if you look closely.
Wait a second. I want to look closely.
And this Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language is part of a collection of documents. There are 3 different alphabets of the Egyptian grammar, and then alphabets of the Egyptian language, and then there's the Egyptian alphabet and grammar that goes along with them, has some of the same material, but also has different material. What you can see clearly in the left-hand side, you've got characters that are written on the papyri that exist today, and then in the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, or sometimes shortened as Gale, you can see you have characters tracking with the characters from right to left that then have explanations in the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language that are showing this relationship. Remember what the church said. We don't know the relationship between these 2 documents. That is a demonstrable lie. And we'll talk about why. So now we've connected the papyri to the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. If we can go to the next slide. So what's on the left-hand side of the slide is something I pulled from the Joseph Smith papers. They have a very good breakdown, to their credit, of the different characters that are in these documents, in these Kirtland Egyptian papers. So when it says in that second column, when it says A, B, C, P1, D5, what that's talking about is the alphabet that they've labeled Egyptian alphabet A, the alphabet that they've labeled Egyptian alphabet B, Egyptian alphabet C, and then the P1, D5 is what's actually known as that grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language that we were looking at on the very last slide. You can then see this character that they've designated in the first column, 1.15. You can see that character that's 1.15 across all of those different documents. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah, so that's the same character in each of those columns being translated a little differently in each one.
Exactly. So you can see then the transliteration where they call it iota, 2s, zip, zip. So that's where they're taking it and putting it in supposedly what it would have been in Egyptian. And
You
then
had me at zip, zip.
I had you at zip, zip. Yeah. So then we continue on and we can see what it's translated to in English across these different documents in this last column, where this character that, for people who are listening, looks almost like there's a dot and then there's 2 lines, one that's curved. It almost looks kind of like a T in some form, but the bottom leg of the T is curved to the left, and then there's a dot. That's translated
like a baseball diamond, and that's the pitcher's mound.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me too.
It's not a good diamond, though.
No, it's not. And depending on which character you're looking at, sometimes it'll be more curved or less curved. But the bottom line is we've got this same or similar characters. It's got the same translation into supposedly what it would have been in Egyptian. And then in English, we can see it's translated consistently as the land of Egypt first seen underwater. Sometimes it's referencing a woman. And then you can see in the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, it has an even bigger explanation talking about this woman that sees the land of Egypt being a daughter of Ham. This would have been the woman that the book of Abraham names Egyptus, which I think is just a figment of Joseph Smith's imagination. On the right-hand side of the screen, I've then pulled from the manuscript. There are 3 also manuscripts of the book of Abraham. So this is what the scribes would have been doing as they were translating with Joseph Smith the papyri. And what you can see is he's got a grouping of 3 characters, including this same exact character that we see translated as meaning the land of Egypt, this reference to being underwater. And then what I've got here is the English text from the people at the Joseph Smith Papers, breaking down what it is so that we don't have to look at it in cursive. It's translated, this grouping of 3 characters is translated, and we can see that middle character is the same character. And Randy, you can probably see it there. We've got references to the land of Egypt, the woman discovering underwater. We have the reference to her springing forth from the loins of Ham. The bottom line is this. The church's claim is that the relationship between the Egyptian writings on the papyri and the book of Abraham as it exists today cannot be known or is not known. That is a lie. By any reasonable standard, when you would look at what we just walked through here with just one character, we can see the clear relationship between these texts and Joseph Smith's role in producing them. The only reason the apologists have to say stuff like this, and the church has this in their essay, is because these Kirtland Egyptian papers are so damning to Joseph Smith's claim to have translated Egyptian or to have understood what the Egyptian language was on a very basic level. Egyptian does not translate this way, where 3 characters will generate a paragraph of text. It's that simple. My point is that this statement by the church is an absolute lie, and it's an example of this selective skepticism where they apply a standard in a way of special pleading that they would apply to no other thing. If we were dealing with a competing faith system and they were trying to disprove that faith system, you and I both know that Mormons would not make this same claim that, well, we just don't know the relationship between these doctrines. Because the relationship is so obvious unless you're determined not to figure it out. Your thoughts?
Yeah, this is the same thing as the church saying about the CES scandal. We consider the matter closed.
Yes. Because we must.
Kolby, I gotta go to a trophy shop. You deserve a Grand Slam trophy on that explanation.
Yes,
it is
you do.
Just a fatal death blow to Joseph Smith's claim of being a translator and a prophet.
Mm-hmm.
And if I said CES scandal, I meant SEC scandal. I'm dyslexic, don't you know?
Randy didn't even give you a hard time. Here's another example of selective skepticism. This was from the last episode you and I did RFM when we were talking about critical thinking and logical fallacies. And I just thought this comment from one of the listeners, someone named Risto, commented, "Why does it matter if what you believe is true?" And to me, that is one of the most absurd questions you can ask. The reason it matters, let me start over. The reason why it matters if what you believe is true is because we have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of things we can prioritize. And there's this concept known as opportunity costs. Every minute you spend researching or believing something that isn't true is a minute you can't spend furthering something that actually is true. The only reason people ask questions like this and pivot to this weird selective skepticism is because they don't want to admit the obvious. Just like we did with the book of Abraham, where the church has to say, we don't know the relationship between these two things. The only reason you would ask, why do I care if what I believe is true, is because you know deep down that what you believe isn't true, and you're desperate not to admit that fact.
Yeah, well, we all go to the grave anyway, regardless of what we believe, whether what we believe is true, right? Maybe that's what Risto's getting at. But you're right. I mean, how much time have I spent in Mormonism studying things that I could have been studying other things? I'm just so grateful that God has blessed me with this opportunity of podcasting now in the latter portion of my life, that I can use all this crazy untrue stuff that I studied for decades.
Yeah. I wrote a book, Post-Traumatic Thriving, and part of me wants to be upset over the 50 plus years that I gave discretionary time and money to the church, sent 3 of my 4 kids on missions, and on, what we all go through as members, and realizing that was a waste. But the final chapter is gratitude. I guess the most productive, positive way you can look at it is being, like you just said, RFM, being grateful for the lessons and doing something about it now. And I think that's why, we spend our time, looking at this in efforts to both process what we've been through and maybe help a few folks out that are dealing with the same stuff.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mostly do it to dunk on Jacob Hansen, but yes. Also
well, that's good too. That's honorable.
Is Jacob Hansen ever going to honor the debate that he proposed with you about the Book of Mormon?
I think you and I both know the answer to that question, RFM.
Okay, so he's not going to. He's just a liar from the beginning. Is that what you're saying?
He's still looking for a good deal on a bulletproof vest.
Well, I know a couple of guys who could sell him one.
Yeah.
Occam's razor. What's that?
Well, I think just to highlight how absurd it is to say, why do you care if what you believe is true? I wanted to highlight this idea of Occam's razor. That's the idea that if you have two competing ideas to explain the same phenomenon or the same evidence, if we're looking at the same evidence, you should prefer the simpler explanation, the explanation that brings the least amount of assumptions to it. Sometimes there's some confusion on what a simpler explanation actually means. And that's why I like this statement of it. The law of parsimony, or what's known as Occam's razor, recommends searching for explanations constructed with the fewest possible set of elements. And the reason for this is because there are an unlimited possible number of arguments and worldviews that can be accepted without being a skeptic. If we're willing to just go another level above, you can do that ad infinitum, like we've already talked about. So sometimes people will get this question of how can you find meaning without the church? And when we're talking about this idea of selective skepticism, I just had this thought last night. So this was a later ad for me. If you'll go to the next slide, RFM. When I think about Occam's razor, I think about how meaning is sometimes used against people who leave the church. I'm sure both of you probably were confronted with questions like this. Well, what gives your life meaning if you're not going to be part of the church? Or what gives your life meaning if you don't believe in this or that? And what I thought of is there's this line from the Book of Mormon, right? Where we're taught that this life is the time for men to prepare to meet God. Yea, behold, the day of this life is the day for men to perform their labors. On the right-hand side, I put together this kind of funny image of what I view as like angels above us silent notes taking, which is I'm living my life and then angels are recording all of these things by looking down at it. It's a humorous way of looking at it. But I guess what I wanted to say is when people hit you with that question of what gives your life meaning if it's not this belief, and I'll only speak from my personal experience, when I viewed everything in my life as a form of test, as we're taught right here in this scripture that's in Alma, it never allowed me to be fully present in any individual moment. And I mean that in a very literal way, because I thought that those moments of me sitting there eating cereal, doing work, going to work, walking, I thought that every single one of those moments was in furtherance of some goal. I thought that they were part of this cosmic drama that I was part of, right? And that, at least for me, in that sense, meaning was this additional layer of reality that I didn't really know if it existed. And it often kept me trapped, anxious, and stressed about what the day-to-day goings on in my life meant for this additional level of reality. So the reason that I care if what I believe is actually true is so that I can connect with the things that I know exist, and that then allows me to be fully present.
That's beautifully expressed. This is not going to be as beautiful, but does it have anything to do with this question? How many of you, am I the only one who's ever been going to the bathroom as a TBM and wondering how many people in the spirit world can see me? That was one of my biggest concerns after I got baptized and I learned the truth.
That's awesome.
I didn't take a dump for weeks.
Oh.
Is that like what you're talking about, Kolby?
Oh, that was exactly what I was talking about. Yes. When I was talking about the angels above us silent notes taking, I was talking about them being envious of you in the bathroom. That's what I was talking about.
You have
Well,
a way,
everything's
RFM, of
important.
articulating what we're all actually thinking of.
Now we're to number 10. Remember, there's 12. We're at 3 hours and 8 minutes. So let's see if we can bring this home. Number 10, equivocation. Maybe there'll only be 11.
Number 10 is equivocation and meaning that I just talked about, which the fact that you don't believe in like a hidden meaning doesn't mean that your life can't have value and meaning. So this is itself my transition point into equivocation, where equivocation is the logical fallacy where you use ambiguous language or multiple meanings to conceal the truth or to avoid commitment to a position. So the example, which we already just highlighted, and I had delineated on that screen, RFM. It was talking about how the church's new essay talks about how Joseph Smith did not translate the Book of Abraham by conventional means. Well, yeah, no, duh, he didn't translate the Book of Abraham at all. And so you can see that here, the example. Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham when pressed. Well, not a literal translation. It was more of a revelatory process, or this expanded translation. And so this is equivocation because it's taking this term translating and quietly redefining it depending upon the audience and upon the need for the argument. So my hallmarks of someone engaging in equivocation are the use of vague terms, debate bro tactics, and we'll give an example of that in just a second. Conspiratorial thinkers often do this, and people who are attempting to manipulate often do this by using equivocation almost as a form of Motte and Bailey. The frequent use of slogans and deepities, again, that term from Dan Dennett, is also a hallmark of someone engaging in equivocation.
Okay.
And they're also moving the goalposts.
Absolutely. So here I've got who I have now dubbed the Earl of Equivocation, Jordan B. Peterson, and I've got an adorable claymation version of him saying, well, what do you mean by, just imagine Kermit the Frog's voice coming out of that claymation character. And I've got a great clip of Jordan Peterson doing some of his most egregious equivocations in this clip here. It's just 30 seconds.
So people say to me, do you believe in God? And I think, okay, there's a couple of mysteries in that question. What do you mean do? What do you mean you? What do you mean believe? And what do you mean God? And you say as the questioner, well, we already know what all those things mean, except belief in God. And I think, no, if we're going to get down to the fundamental brass tacks, we don't really know what any of those things.
I'm stuck on the term in. What does that mean?
Yeah, that was the one he didn't ask. I think to steelman his position, I think the fair thing to ask for follow-up on the definition is God. What do you mean by believe in God? That is a term that can be subject to multiple different definitions depending on what people mean. But to ask, what do you believe? What do you mean by believe? What do you mean by do? What do you mean believe by you? No one is that confused on what language means unless they have to be. And they're trying not to commit to a point. And I think Jordan Peterson is the king of that.
What do you think, Randy? Do you like Jordan Peterson?
Well, I went to Long Beach once and heard him speak with my sons. Jordan Peterson is like anybody, really. There's things that he says that I think are right on the money and very profound, and other things, I'm left scratching my head, and other things I just don't agree with. So it's a mixed bag.
What do you mean by bag? No, I'm just kidding.
What do you mean by it?
Say that again.
I mean Jacob Hansen, damn it. When I say douche canoe, I mean Jacob Hansen. And when I say Jacob Hansen, I mean douche canoe. Would you have another example here from Jordan Peterson?
I do. So Jordan Peterson was recently on Jubilee's program known as Surrounded, where they'll host one person. Our friend Alex O'Connor, or not our friend, but someone we've commented on before, RFM, Alex O'Connor did that. That's where he and Jacob first met. Jordan Peterson was on an episode of this show called Surrounded, where it was Jordan Peterson surrounded by 20 atheists. And they had some interesting conversations, but I thought this one is just another clear example of equivocation on what a Christian is.
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a Christian or you're not.
To you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something. You are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.
So the way that exchange ended probably didn't reflect great, I think, on either of them. But if you'll go to the next slide, RFM, then I'll make my point.
I've seen this before. I think the kid was actually being rude, but also saying, but you're nothing because you're not even a Christian. So why are you even here?
And if you actually go to the next slide down, this is the actual title of the video to vindicate the kid a little bit. The actual title when Jubilee posted it was "One Christian versus 20 Atheists." That's the point of the series, is to surround one person to defend their worldview against 20 people who disagree with it. And my point of here is not necessarily to draw attention to anything other than the equivocation, which is if you're in a video that's titled "One Christian versus 20 Atheists" and you can't commit to whether you are or are not a Christian, that is a desperate attempt to avoid taking a position because it's convenient to do so. That is a form itself of equivocation.
Randy, I feel like you're going to be made to feel better again by whoever wrote up this thumbnail.
Well, the thumbnail says Jordan Peterson versus 20 atheists, and then some script underneath it, I don't know if it's part of the post, says one Christian versus 20 atheists. So I'm wondering if, I mean, the thumbnail itself doesn't say Christian, but the other text does. So I don't know enough about it to really know.
So the text below it is the title, and then the thumbnail doesn't have the title. That's sometimes they disagree slightly.
I know that as no matter how many atheists you have in a room, it should be E before I. That's all I'm saying. E before I, except after pi. That's the rule.
Yeah.
Anyways, if we can continue on.
Yes. There's a lot of misspelling going on out there. Good thing I'm here.
Don't get him, RFM.
It's a good thing you got me here.
Oh, I was just going to highlight this video, if people want to watch it, went so badly for Jordan Peterson that even Jacob Hansen, who's made multiple videos about how much he loves Jordan Peterson, said that the Jordan Peterson era is over. I just thought that was funny.
I think that's kind of fair. Sorry, go ahead, RFM.
Well, it wasn't a big thing. I just think that Jordan got emotionally involved. He really didn't like this kid. Whatever happened before this clip, he doesn't like this kid or something's going on, and he got all personal about it instead of just talking about the issues. And I think that was his main failing, at least from the clip that you played.
Well, yes, from that clip. For what it's worth in the series, and this is the same for all of them, not just Jordan Peterson's, the person who's in the middle has to defend 4 different claims. Jordan did a really, really bad job. And I agree with Randy. There are things I've heard from Jordan Peterson that I do think are interesting and are true. I think what I'm highlighting here is that equivocation, again, if we go back to the hallmarks, equivocation is often used by people who are looking at this like a debate, like a conversation where I need to win. And that's why they refuse to commit to a position. And the entire episode is basically an exercise in Jordan not wanting to commit to any position, rather than he
knows that as soon as he does, he knows the arguments that are going to come down the pipe to destroy his position.
Exactly. And my point here is just, it went so badly that even someone who's publicly praised this guy and made him an idol, he literally has it right there. Jordan Peterson is one of my heroes. It went so badly that he did a response talking about how Jordan Peterson's past his prime. So,
wow, that's too bad. I mean, who is Jacob Hansen going to imitate now?
Who knows? Maybe you.
Maybe.
Another clear example of equivocation with translation is a few years ago, there was a conference held at Utah State University in Logan that was called New Perspectives on Joseph Smith and Translation. They hosted Richard Bushman, Terrell Givens, Jared Hickman. You can see it's just so funny, this pitch for this conference. One key to understanding Mormonism's prophetic founder, Joseph Smith, is to grapple with his sharply distinctive practice of translation. Come take advantage of a unique day-long conversation by some of Mormon studies' leading minds on this challenging issue. And I thought, sharply distinctive practice of translation is an equivocation of translations that don't look anything like an actual translation. That's really what they're saying.
It's the 21st century, and now we're having to argue. All the smart eggheads are having to redefine what translation means. I wonder why that would be.
Exactly, because they have to use the vague term of translation because the typical term or the typical definition doesn't work for what Joseph Smith was doing.
Yes, and if I were being too coy, what I mean is you don't have to redefine translation until you find out that that's not what Joseph Smith was doing.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Any thoughts on this one, Randy?
It's kind of a side note, but as you guys know, I have kind of an obsession with Dartmouth, and I think that explains a lot of Mormonism. And John Smith, which was Dartmouth's first professor, was a true, legitimate translator. He could translate Greek into English and Latin, and he had a command of numerous languages. Hiram Smith, attended Dartmouth, and translation was the big thing there. And this is my own personal opinion. I have nothing but conjecture around it. I don't have any evidence. But my impression is that Joseph Smith saw this going on in his community and was jealous of it. And what do you know? He became a translator. But when you really look at his translations, now they're walking that back, which is really kind of amusing to watch.
Yeah.
Right, when his big claim to fame is translating the Book of Mormon.
Exactly.
Well, and as evidence for your claim, Randy, I think the original version of that Doctrine and Covenants provision talks about how Joseph Smith's first gift is as a translator, and he's told to pretend to no other gift, and then that's been changed over time. So that might reflect that jealousy that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yes, he's the only president of the church to have all 4 titles: prophet, seer, revelator, and translator.
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Number 11.
Number 11 is the argument from incredulity. And again, there were times as we were going through some of your guys' slides where I was like, oh, that's also a perfect argument from incredulity. It's because an idea, an argument that can be fallacious in more than one way, right? It can come in many different flavors. Argument from incredulity is premised off of claiming that something must be false or true because it seems so unbelievable or hard to imagine.
So if it's unbelievable, then it must be false. And if it's easy to believe, then it must be true.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe it's hard to believe that it's hard to believe it's false, so it must be true, or it's hard to believe it's true, so it must be false.
Mm-hmm. And to go hand in hand with Randy's earlier mention of the Dunning-Kruger effect, arguments from incredulity often result from Dunning-Kruger, from someone who doesn't understand something, asking a question that if you did understand what that theory or the thing you're asking about actually says, the question would seem very silly. The example that I'd give, since we mentioned evolution a little earlier in the slides, and my dad and I have joked about this since, so I'm not just making fun of him. When we were talking once about evolution, when I was at BYU in my program, I took 3 human evolution courses. And I remember one time I was talking to my dad about that, and he said, the classic trope, you guys have probably heard it yourselves, where he said, well, if we evolved from chimpanzees or monkeys, why are there still monkeys, right? That's a classic example of an argument from incredulity. It's basically saying that the theory that the person doesn't understand posits something that the theory itself never posits.
That sounds like a straw man.
It is, exactly. It is a straw man, and it's also an argument from incredulity because they're not understanding it, and that's how they base their argument. The example here with Mormonism, how can an educated farm boy have written the Book of Mormon without divine help? The argument relies on personal disbelief, not evidence. It assumes complexity cannot arise naturally or through a collaborative influence, whether it's Rigdon, Spalding, contemporary ideas.
Yeah, that is a classic, isn't it? We hear that all the time, this argument from incredulity, which underscored is a logical fallacy.
Mm-hmm.
Just because you can't understand it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Or just because you don't believe it doesn't mean it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Which is one reason that kind of testimony is not admissible in court, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make any difference whether you believe something. We're only interested in facts in the courtroom.
Right. So a great example of an argument from incredulity comes from the Light on Truth letter, where he's offering the same exact argument. Where did the Book of Mormon come from? After this seems like the same quote. I even went to go double check because it's so similar.
But they're different. This is not the same quote.
This is not the same quote. Nope.
Well, his AI was getting lazy.
I guess. Would you read that one for us, RFM?
Yeah. Where did the Book of Mormon come from? After years of interacting with critics' ideas about the Book of Mormon's creation, I saw more and more holes. Critics suggest several theories, but those theories contradict one another. Any one theory sounds reasonable by itself, and actually, by the way, they don't necessarily contradict each other. They can be seen as supplemental. Any one theory sounds reasonable by itself, but as soon as I attempt to create a plausible narrative, it all falls apart. Critics do not seem to understand that contradictory theories are mutually debilitating instead of reinforcing, said Mr. Tight Translation versus Loose Translation. I started to see that many critics start with naturalistic assumptions. Angels don't give plates to men. It seems like a pretty good place to start to me and Julie Andrews, and attempt to reverse engineer how Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon.
Mm-hmm. And so you can see this is just a classic argument from incredulity. I don't understand how Joseph Smith might have done it naturalistically. Therefore, he didn't do it naturalistically. That's really what his argument boils down to here. Any comments from you on this one, Randy?
Yeah, I think one of the most brilliant, well, don't tell RFM this, but one of the most brilliant things he has ever observed, at least in my opinion, is this relationship between setting up the Book of Mormon as remarkable literature that surpasses Shakespeare and really elevating it, and then making Joseph Smith as certified dumb as possible, uneducated farm boy. Well, I think as far as the first part of that argument, all you have to do is read the Book of Mormon and decide for yourself just how remarkable literature that is. That's a very subjective question. But on the poor, uneducated farm boy thing, I think, since I've done those episodes on Dartmouth, I've gotten slammed with criticisms, and the Midnight Mormons did a TikTok, attacking that whole thing about Joseph Smith being immersed in this high Ivy League level of education, at least this community. And Hiram actually attended, the Morse School at Dartmouth, and all of this information flowing to Joseph Smith as he convalesced for 4 years from his leg surgery. I guess a couple quick points. One is the gap is really shrunk in doing that, number one. Number two, as I said earlier, there are numerous plausible explanations for how the Book of Mormon came to be. Pick one, just like RFM and I can explain numerous ways that David Copperfield did a certain trick. There's more than one way to do a production trick, which is what Joseph Smith's doing. He's doing production tricks with producing the Book of Mormon, producing the Book of Abraham, and on and on. They're production tricks. The other point I forgot, but it was brilliant, and we'll have to think about that later.
Okay.
Maybe I'll remind you as we keep going.
Okay.
Let's put this back up here. So still on the argument from incredulity.
Yeah, so here are a few other examples that we hear, recurrently, right? Why didn't the witnesses deny their testimony when they left the church? Why would Joseph go through so much persecution for something that wasn't true? If the church isn't true, how do you explain? A hallmark of an argument from incredulity is going to start with the assumption that they're not willing to divorce themselves from, right? If the church isn't true, how does blah, blah, blah? That's a hallmark of an argument from incredulity. If this reality isn't so, how do you blah? That's always a good example of the template.
So that was also a main factor in Elder Holland's talk in General Conference that I played that clip about, which is why would anybody do this? Why would they go through this? Why would they give their lives for something that they knew was a fraud?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was an episode of RFM from years ago, I'm sure, but you shared a short story once from Stephen King about the silver dollar that made such a good point.
Oh, yeah.
Of this.
Oh, you want me to repeat it?
No.
Good, because it was a short story, but yeah. The story of that silver dollar, that cartwheel is what it was referred to. It was an Old West story. It was great.
Yep. Let's see if I had any more examples. I can't remember off the top of my head. Oh, yeah. This one. So Sarah Allen does work for Fair Mormon and did a 68-part or more response to the CES letter. I'll just say the fact that Mormon apologists are so focused on the CES letter so many years later, I think it came out in 2013, and here they're writing about it in 2022. And in fact, they continue to write about it and talk about it all the time today, is its own damning indictment. Anyways, this apologist, Sarah Allen, she highlights, I think, here really well an argument from incredulity. So she has this line from Jeremy Runnels' CES letter, where he says, I am now supposed to believe that Joseph has the credibility of translating ancient records when the Book of Abraham and the Kinderhook plates destroy this claim? And here's her response. Look for the argument from incredulity here. We're not supposed to believe anything. We're invited to believe by the Savior through the Holy Spirit. He doesn't force us to. And as far as Joseph's translating skills go, the beauty of that is that you don't have to take anyone else's word for it. The Spirit will tell you whether Joseph was a prophet or not, and whether the scriptures he translated are true works of scriptures. However, the Book of Abraham and the Kinderhook plates are not the slam dunks Jeremy thinks they are. To repeat a paragraph in one of my previous posts, if you are going to claim that Joseph failed in his transaction of the Book of Abraham, she meant translation of the Book of Abraham, you have to explain away all of the things he got right. I'm going to read that last sentence one more time. If you are going to claim that Joseph failed in his transaction of the Book of Abraham, you have to explain away all of the things he got right. RFM, can you highlight why that's an argument from incredulity?
Yeah, I think so, because she's saying that I can't imagine his getting whatever he got right unless he could actually do it.
Exactly.
I can explain how he got all the things right that he got right in one word. Coincidence.
Yeah, and not only is this an argument from incredulity, but it's also a clear shift of the burden of proof that Randy talked about earlier, and why that's fallacious. Saying
Onus probandi.
Onus probandi, yes.
Yes.
Saying you must explain away all of these things or accept my conclusion is a clear shift of the burden of proof, and it's also an argument from incredulity. And I think to drive this point home, if you'll go to the next slide, this is just the example we've used before throughout our Light and Truth Letter Response series. If we've got an $18.99 $5 silver certificate that we're trying to determine the legitimacy of, and it lines up with the consistency of the paper, the dating of the paper, the consistency of the ink, the official marks, the authenticity of the serial numbers, if all of those details match, but it's got the wrong signature for the Secretary of the Treasury, it doesn't matter how the fraudster was able to recreate all the legitimate parts. There are some pieces of evidence that automatically dictate that that thing cannot be what it claims to be. And go ahead.
But if it has the wrong signature and you're saying you know it's a fraud because of that, how do you explain how the person was able to use the right paper from the same time period and the ink?
Yep, and that highlights exactly why it's a fallacy. It does not matter, and I don't know is an acceptable answer to those questions.
Yes.
But what I definitely know is that if it doesn't have the right signature, it isn't what it purports to be. However it came to be may be its own interesting thing to explain. Like Randy said, there are many people working on different theories of where the Book of Mormon did come from a naturalistic point of view. But the fact that we don't fully know yet does not mean that we don't know what the Book of Mormon is and is not. And it is not what it purports to be, period.
Right. And thank you for picking up so well on that, the point of that question, which is you could have no answer for how on earth this forger of this bill, right, came up with the paper or the ink or did the design. You may not be able to explain any of that, but you can still know it's a fake by the wrong signature.
Mm-hmm.
So really, the critic doesn't have to give any explanation for how Joseph Smith created the Book of Mormon to know it's a fake.
Mm-hmm.
Just the same as any other fraudulent thing in the world, including this hypothetical bill.
Mm-hmm.
Randy,
any thoughts on this one?
No, it goes back to the foundational aspects of critical thinking, onus probandi, and you're absolutely right. The critics don't have an obligation to explain it, although a number of critics have given perfectly plausible explanations, and then of course you can counter it with the Quran, which arguably is far more successful than the Book of Mormon, and an illiterate sheep herder, Muhammad, how did he possibly, create this document, this, revered by so many millions and millions of people? I think we're kind of hitting all the nails on the head here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Muhammad actually had a brother who attended Dartmouth for a brief period of time.
Which reminds me, I thought of that third brilliant point. And that is, if this Dartmouth thing was no big deal, why, when you go through the Saints book and Joseph Smith's own history and his mother's history and the church website, for the whole spectrum of stuff, why does the church now make such an obvious attempt to omit any discussion of Joseph Smith being anywhere near Dartmouth? And RFM, you've been there, you've seen the two home sites of Joseph Smith and how close they are to the university. He was right smack in the middle of this university milieu. It's interesting in and of itself that so many people across 200 years have tried to bury that fact.
And like you said, the thing I try and say is that the argument for the apologist is to make Joseph Smith as dumb as possible, to lower that part so much, and to raise the literary quality and inflate that of the Book of Mormon so greatly, right? To make you got to make the distance as big as possible between Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon so that you can fit God in between.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. It's like it's really a spin on like Joseph of the gaps. We widen that gap as much as we can so that we can insert Joseph Smith having some divine calling as a translator into that gap. Absolutely.
Very good. And finally, number 12, everybody, the final logical fallacy we'll be talking about today.
Our last one, and it's really the basis of all logical fallacies truly, is the non sequitur. It's where the conclusion does not follow from the premises of the argument. That's why logical fallacies are fallacious, because they don't directly connect to the truth, even though they seem like they do. The reasoning then jumps disconnectedly from the argument's setup to a conclusion, often relying on emotion, assumption, or irrelevance instead of logic. So, for example, the Book of Mormon has inspired millions of people, so it must be true. Or the fruits of the church are so great, so it must be true. Non sequiturs camouflage faulty logic with appealing conclusions. They often give people the illusion of reason, when in reality, the argument is riding on sentiment or social momentum. I think I have an example or two here as well.
Yeah, and I remember this simply because even though it's non sequitur, the non part we all get because we talk about non in our language. The sequitur comes from sequence. Okay. So it doesn't follow in a sequential order. It's a non sequitur.
Yeah. So coming from our buddy Austin Fife again, this is actually a series of his questions. All of these questions that RFM and I will joke about as we go through each of these chapters are their own form of non sequiturs. And in fact, I've included what we called Austin's best argument in the Light and Truth letter on purpose, to say even his best argument is a non sequitur. That's part of the point. He's talking about the land of Jershon, which is an inheritance, and you can see in the way he phrases it, how interesting is it that the word Jershon is likely Hebrew for place of inheritance? Well, I don't know. How interesting is that supposed to be? Does it mean that the Book of Mormon is what it purports to be? It absolutely does not, which is why it's a non sequitur. We have another one. How fascinating is it that recent findings validate the depiction of the world in the Book of Mormon? RFM and I have blasted his arguments about the Book of Mormon to Kingdom Come. I think there's no need to belabor this point. The point is just when he's asking these questions, they never really connect to the direct truth. And I think I have one more slide of them. Yeah, how did Joseph Smith get so lucky to predict the location of Bountiful in the near eastward direction from Nahum? Well, first of all, he didn't, and we talked about that. But even if he did, does that directly connect to the truth of the Book of Mormon's claims? No, it does not. Does literary evidence undeniably verify the Book of Mormon's claims of divine origin? Not quite. However, isn't it interesting, compelling, worth exploring? He just does this ad infinitum. When you read the Light and Truth letter, it's just full of these perplexing questions that seem like they're making a point, but they never really do. And
I agree with him that the literary stuff and other aspects of the Book of Mormon are worth exploring. And based upon his book, I think it would be a good idea for him to explore some of those things.
Yes, it would. Because they never directly relate to the truth claims of the Book of Mormon. That's why they're non sequiturs. Did I have maybe one more slide? I think I did.
Let's see. Yep.
Oh, yep. Another few examples. Chiasmus is an ancient literary Hebraism. Therefore, the Book of Mormon must be ancient. How does that connect, right? People can see why that's a non sequitur. Joseph Smith was uneducated, so he couldn't have written the Book of Mormon. Not true.
Just to substitute, Shakespeare was uneducated, so he couldn't have written his plays.
Or Muhammad, as Randy did with the Quran. It shows why it's a non sequitur.
Uneducated people are doing smart things all the time.
Exactly. People feel the spirit when they read the Book of Mormon, so it must be true. Joseph Smith died as a martyr. Why would he die for something that wasn't true? That's literally Holland's entire point, is a non sequitur in that safety for the soul talk. The church has helped my life, so it must be led by God. Secular historians, even the great Harold Bloom, think that Joseph Smith was a genius. See, even non-believers support his prophetic calling. None of these directly relate to the truth of the claims, which is why they're non sequiturs.
Randy, any thoughts from you about non sequitur arguments?
No, but other than I agree with all of this, I'm reading them over myself. Do you mind putting that back up? Yeah, the one that struck me was uneducated. I just want to put a finer point on that. Joseph Smith, it is true, Joseph Smith was not formally educated very well, but he was highly educated. I'm sorry, to have your brother Hiram, who is a true intellectual, very brilliant guy. Hiram is not, the church doesn't talk much about Hiram, and for good reason, because he, in my opinion, he was the intellectual brains behind Mormonism. He's going off to the Dartmouth campus every day. He's attending over 1,000 theological lectures at the Church of Christ, which, by the way, is the name of the church, the Mormon church that Joseph Smith first plagiarized when he started the Mormon church. Getting over 1,000 theological lectures there. And then he's coming home every day and tutoring Joseph Smith privately as he convalesced from a leg surgery done by the doctor who founded Dartmouth Medical School. So to say he's not educated, he was highly educated. He just wasn't formally educated.
Mm-hmm. RFM's muted, so I'm going to launch into my point, which is to drive that point home too, Randy. One of the things RFM and I talked about in one of our Light and Truth Letter episodes is if you look at Joseph Smith's writings in 1830, he wrote 2 letters in 1830 to the Colesville Saints, one in August and one in December. They are laced with scriptural language, and they were dictated just like he did with the Book of Mormon. I think it was one of the Whitmers maybe, but people can look it up in that, either in that episode or on Joseph Smith papers. But one of the letters, they're only short letters, like they're 2 pages, maybe 3 pages. One of them has 20 scriptural allusions and works scriptural phrases, sometimes in the same sentence, quotations or allusions from multiple books of scripture into one sentence. I feel very strongly that Joseph Smith, regardless of his level of formal education, like you've highlighted, he was very comfortable with dictating and talking in scriptural-ish language. That's one of the prime reasons that I really don't give any mind to the Spalding-Rigdon manuscript theorists that are making a recent recurrence, I think because of Lars Nielsen's book, is I just don't see the need for the hypothesis, because when I look at Joseph Smith's writings contemporary to the Book of Mormon, they look very much like the Book of Mormon to me. Not the length and complexity, I'll give people that, but as far as working scriptural sounding language together, it seems like it was Joseph Smith's superpower, in my view at least.
It was his knack.
Yeah.
He had a knack for it and for storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
What I was going to quote was,
he was a genius. Joseph Smith was a genius. I'll give him that for sure. But when you take this quote, uneducated poor farm boy out of the Dartmouth community and transplant him over to Palmyra, New York, it would look miraculous, because the guy is pontificating things that, uneducated farm boys normally wouldn't be saying.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And like Albert Einstein wrote about education is what's left over after you've forgotten everything you learned in school. And he knew a thing or two about it, probably. All right. So now we are at the last slide. It's called conclusion, appropriately enough. Do you want to lead us home, Kolby?
Yep, I had this quote from one of Carl Sagan's books. The lack is not in intelligence, which is in plentiful supply. Rather, the scarce commodity is systematic training in critical thinking. This is something that Carl Sagan championed right up until he passed in 1996. And I think it really helps for me, understand why I spent time studying epistemology, critical thinking, and these logical fallacies is because they are used so prevalently, not just in Mormonism, but in political discourse, in civil discourse, in everyday conversation. And to go back to that earlier quote I quoted from Carl Sagan as well, it's the logical fallacies are the language of charlatans, of people who want to take advantage of you. Sometimes they're buying into the logical fallacy themselves and are taking advantage of themselves. I think that that's the case with the leaders of the church, that they just have bought into this fiction for so long that they can't even see their way out. But the bottom line is the reason we study these things, or we do an episode like this, is to help people understand why it's important to steer clear of logical fallacies, even for people who are believers like Randy, right? Randy believes in things that RFM and I don't, but he tries to steer clear of the logical fallacies the same way, because the things that are true will withstand this level of scrutiny, and the things that can't should be rejected.
Very good. Randy, what are your concluding thoughts?
My concluding thoughts are this. Kolby, I love your definition with logical fallacies being deceptively bad arguments. Quite honestly, I'm going to steal that and plagiarize it from you and use it here on out. That's a beautiful explanation. And what we're really talking about in terms of framing this whole conversation, I think we're giving John Dehlin a little competition for length here, is we're talking about the contrast of deceptively bad arguments versus intellectually honest arguments. And people who are intellectually honest mean that they welcome checks and balances. They welcome being confronted respectfully, of course, but intelligently with counter arguments, and facing their doubts and exploring things that may be uncomfortable. As I mentioned, Bart Ehrman is a master of that, and inviting everybody to the table, and everybody is listened to, and everybody feels welcome. I just want to point out that intellectually honest organizations do exist. Biola University, which is right up the street near LA here, invites, in front of their whole student body, invites atheists to debate with the professors. It's a Bible school, and the whole student body is there to listen to the debates between the atheists and the professors. And everybody enjoys it. Everybody is welcome. And this intellectually honest conversation is going on with checks and balances. Same thing with Veritas Forum out of Harvard University. So there are lots of people that are very interested in stark contrast to Mormonism, which shuts all that down. Could you imagine them inviting RFM and you, Kolby, and John Dehlin and Bill Reel and Rebecca and Landon and the whole gang to debate in front of the student body at the Marriott Center, debate the 12 apostles? No, because the Q15 are behind 5 layers of security in an office building where they read speeches off teleprompters and everybody goes, wow. That's not intellectually honest when they won't come out and have actual conversations and actual debates and actual discussions with actual people. And I think the dichotomy is so strong that I'm really kind of excited to be part of this conversation, because we need more checks and balances. I talk to you guys all the time, and I say something stupid and you knock it down, and you know what I do? I got to make an adjustment to my worldview because I was wrong. And it's the same thing why I went on my way to spend time with Bart Ehrman. He really set me straight on a number of things. So I like being challenged. The biggest thing I've come to learn in all of this is, you said, Kolby, I don't know. I don't know either. I mean, I as a Mormon, I was so sure of so much, and it was such a drug. It was like opium to think you knew everything about everything. And now I'm in the world of saying, you know what? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. That's what real life looks like. But there's evidence, and we can look at the things with the best evidentiary value. And that's really, I think all of us are really trying to do.
Well, I want to thank you, Randy and Kolby, for joining me on this special episode of Radio Free Mormon, episode 405, talking about Mormon thinking errors. I think we've done a good job of covering the top 12. There are others. but we're not going to talk about those today. I think we squeezed in a few actually, in addition to the 12 early on, in case you weren't watching. Kolby did that. So thanks everybody for watching. Please hit like, please hit subscribe. Thank you to all my listeners who have gone the extra mile and gone to radiofreemormon.org, and you know who you are, and click that donate button. Thank you so much. And for those of you who know that you haven't done that, I would ask that you do that and do it today while you're thinking about it. Just go to radiofreemormon.org, click the donate button, make a recurring donation of maybe $5, $10 a month, whatever you can afford. Your contributions and donations will keep Radio Free Mormon broadcasting behind enemy lines. Once again, thank you to both of you, Randy and Kolby, and everybody else. We'll see you next time on Radio Free Mormon. This is Radio Free Mormon, signing off the air.